Send him the invitation. I want to see his face when he realizes nobody saved his seat. The corner office smelled like bourbon and leather. A crystal tumbler sat half empty on the mahogany desk, catching the overhead light as fingers drummed a slow, satisfied rhythm beside it. Not just any invitation, the embossed ones. Gold lettering. Make it look real. Former employee recognition. Put him at table 14, next to the service entrance. Laughter. Low. Shared. The kind that passes between people who've agreed on the punchline before the joke begins. The man who'd fired Nolan Ashford 4 months ago was now spending company money to bring him back for one night. Not to apologize, not to make amends. To watch him sit in a ballroom full of people who'd erased him and pretend it didn't sting. What Garrett Caldwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Nolan Ashford had been waiting for exactly this invitation, and the evening it described would end careers, not feelings. If you think you already know where this story is going, you're wrong. Subscribe now, because what happens at that gala will leave you speechless. The Slack message was sent at 9:18 p.m. on a Thursday. Meridian Capital Group's internal leadership channel. 6 recipients, all senior executives, all copied on decisions that shaped 340 employees' lives. The message read, "Added Ashford to the gala list. Category, former employee recognition. Translation, front row seat to watch him squirm. Dress code optional for charity cases." 3 laughing emoji reactions. 1 heart. 1 thumbs up from a user identified as M. Sinclair. That message would eventually become Exhibit D12 in a federal case file. But on the night it was sent, it was just cruelty dressed up as comedy. The kind of casual malice that powerful people mistake for wit because no one in the room has the standing to tell them otherwise. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 months after Nolan Ashford had carried a cardboard box through Meridian Capital's lobby for the last time. Thick envelope, embossed letterhead, the firm's navy and gold crest pressed into cream stock heavy enough to feel important. He opened it standing at the kitchen counter of his apartment on the north side of Richmond, beside 3 prescription bottles lined up in order of his mother's dosing schedule. The words were exactly what he'd expected. Annual Excellence Gala, Jefferson Hotel, honoring contributions to the Meridian family. The kind of corporate language that means everything and nothing simultaneously. He read it twice. Then he smiled. The first time in 4 months. Not because the joke was funny, because they'd just hand-delivered the last piece of evidence he needed. To understand why that smile mattered. Why a fired compliance analyst standing in a 1-bedroom apartment would react to an invitation designed to humiliate him with something closer to satisfaction than shame. You'd need to go back 18 months. To the morning Nolan Ashford walked through Meridian Capital's front doors for the first time and began the longest, quietest fight of his life. 18 months earlier. The lobby of Meridian Capital Group occupied the ground floor of a glass and steel building on East Main Street in downtown Richmond, Virginia. Marble floors, brushed chrome elevator bank, a reception desk staffed by a woman whose smile was calibrated to convey welcome to clients and indifference to everyone else. The firm's diversity statement hung in a brushed aluminum frame beside the elevators, stock photograph of 6 smiling professionals, carefully selected to represent demographics that bore no resemblance to the 11-person executive team upstairs, which was all white, 10 male, and collectively worth more than most of the neighborhoods their employees commuted from. Nolan Ashford arrived at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his scheduled start time. Charcoal slacks. White shirt, no tie. The dress code said business casual, and he'd learned long ago that overdressing on your first day invited the wrong kind of attention. He carried a leather messenger bag that held his laptop, a folder of onboarding documents, and a notebook, not company-issued, personal, bound in dark brown leather with no markings on the cover. The receptionist looked up. The smile recalibrated, polite but cooled, the way it does when someone doesn't match the expected profile of a new hire. "Can I help you?" "Nolan Ashford, starting today in compliance." She checked the screen. Something shifted behind her eyes. not hostility, just recalculation. The compliance department was on the 5th floor. 5th floor hires usually came through the side entrance by the parking garage. Main lobby arrivals were reserved for executives and clients. Take the elevator to 5. HR will meet you. She didn't offer a visitor badge. Didn't explain the building layout. Didn't do any of the things the orientation packet promised new employees could expect on their first morning. Nolan noted this, not with resentment, but with the same clinical precision he'd note a misaligned decimal in a financial statement. Data point. Filed. The elevator opened onto the 5th floor, which smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. The compliance department occupied the east side of the building. 22 cubicles arranged in rows, no windows for anyone below manager level, and a kitchenette whose microwave had seen better administrations. Nolan's assigned space sat between the copy room and the service elevator, a location that guaranteed constant foot traffic, ambient noise, and the message, intended or not, that his presence was incidental to the department's actual work. Margot Sinclair met him at the cubicle. HR director. Mid-50s, white, highlighted hair pulled back in a style that suggested expense. Her handshake was firm, her smile was practiced. She held his onboarding folder like a prop. "Welcome to the team, Noel." "Nolan." "Right, Nolan." She didn't apologize for the error. "Let's get you set up." The onboarding process took 2 hours. During those 2 hours, Margot mispronounced his name twice more. Noland, then Noel again. The correct spelling appeared on every document she handed him. She'd printed his name 11 times across orientation materials, benefits forms, and IT access requests. 11 times, and still, the word that came out of her mouth didn't match the letters she'd put on paper. He corrected her gently each time. She nodded each time. Nothing changed. By noon, he'd been issued an access badge, coded level high, which restricted him to floors 3 through 5 and the parking garage. The employee handbook specified level BA for all compliance analysts, which included access to the server room on 7 and the executive conference suite on 8. He flagged the discrepancy to IT. The ticket was logged. It would take 11 days to correct. Other new hires processed in the same month received corrected badges within 48 hours. Another data point. His desk had no nameplate. Every other occupied cubicle in the row had one, white plastic, laser printed, slotted into a holder on the partition wall. Nolan didn't ask about it. He opened his leather notebook, wrote the date, the time, and a single line. Day 1, badge level high, should be Bay, name mispronounced Nyunba, no nameplate. A colleague passing by, young, white, 1 cubicle over, glanced at the notebook. "What's that? A journal?" "Grocery lists." Nolan closed the cover. The colleague laughed. Nolan didn't. During his first week, 2 things became clear about Meridian Capital Group. The first was that the firm operated on a set of unwritten rules far more powerful than anything in the employee handbook. The executive team lunched together on 8, the floor Nolan's badge couldn't reach. Client meetings happened in rooms booked through an informal system that bypassed the official calendar. Promotions were discussed at a steakhouse on Gray Street every 3rd Thursday, and the invitation list was curated by a man Nolan hadn't yet met, but whose name circulated through the department with the frequency and reverence of a weather report. Garrett Caldwell, Regional Vice President. Ran the Richmond office with the easy authority of someone who'd been in charge long enough that the title felt hereditary. Nolan met him at the weekly all-hands meeting on his second Monday. Garrett walked in 12 minutes late, which everyone understood was a power move and not a scheduling conflict. 6'1", athletic build going soft at the middle, suit jacket slung over one shoulder like he'd just come from something more important. He addressed the room the way a host addresses guests, with the confidence that every person present existed, in some functional sense, at his pleasure. "Quick updates, people. Revenue's up 7%. Compliance passed state audit. Thank the team for that." He gestured vaguely toward the section of the room where Nolan sat. The gesture encompassed everyone and acknowledged no one specifically. Then he spotted the new face. Nolan felt the gaze land, not hostile, but assessing, the way someone examines furniture they didn't order. "New guy. Ashford, right?" "Nolan Ashford. Yes." "Good. We needed bodies in compliance. Janine will get you up to speed." He moved on without waiting for a response. The room's attention moved with him. Bodies. Not talent, not expertise. Bodies. Nolan wrote that down too. Brock Tillman made himself known that same week. Nolan was carrying a box of files from the archive room to his cubicle. Standard compliance retrieval, nothing unusual, when he turned a corner and collided with 240 pounds of former college linebacker coming the other way. The files scattered, papers fanned across the hallway floor. Nolan stumbled back 2 steps. Brock didn't move, didn't stumble, didn't reach down to help collect the mess. "Watch where you're going, bud." The words came with a smile that had no warmth in it. Brock looked down at the papers covering the floor, looked at Nolan, made no move to assist, then stepped over the scattered files and continued walking. 3 other employees witnessed the collision. 2 looked away. One, a junior analyst named Darnell Okafor, one of 3 black employees in the department, met Nolan's eyes for a half-second before dropping his gaze to the floor. Nolan collected the files alone. The entire process took 4 minutes. Nobody helped. Nobody mentioned it. On the following Tuesday, Nolan entered the break room to find his lunch, packed that morning, labeled with his name, stored in the communal refrigerator as the employee handbook permitted, sitting in the trash can. Not fallen. Placed. The brown bag upright, his name visible, positioned in the center of the bin as if it were a display rather than disposal. He looked at the refrigerator. The shelf where he'd placed his lunch at 7:50 a.m. held someone else's takeout container. No explanation, no note, no apology from whoever had decided his food didn't deserve refrigerator space. He ate from the vending machine that day. Wrote it down. Date, time, location of lunch, in trash, upright, name visible. The second thing that became clear was that Meridian's compliance department served a specific function within the firm's ecosystem, not to ensure compliance, but to create the appearance of it. The department existed so that when regulators asked questions, someone could point to a floor full of cubicles and say, "See, we take this seriously." Whether the actual work produced meaningful oversight was, based on Nolan's first week of observation, genuinely irrelevant to anyone with the authority to change it. Janine Falk, his nominal team lead, confirmed this on day 3 when she dropped 3 bankers' boxes on his desk with a thud that rattled his coffee cup. Legacy audits haven't been touched in 2 years. Files from the 2021 restructuring. Nobody wanted them. She paused, studied him the way someone studies a puzzle they've already decided isn't worth solving. "Welcome to compliance." She walked away before he could respond. Nolan opened the first box. Inside, termination records, performance evaluations, separation agreements, exit interviews, dozens of files, each representing an employee who'd been removed during what the firm called strategic realignment. He pulled the first file, read the cover sheet, set it aside, pulled the second, read, set aside, pulled the third. By the end of the day, he'd read 47 files. By the end of the week, he'd read all 112. And by the end of that first month, he'd identified a pattern that the people who'd created these files either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared to address. But that discovery, and what he did with it, belongs to a later part of this story. For now, what matters is simpler. Nolan Ashford had taken a mid-level compliance job at a firm with a documented history of discrimination, relocated to a city where he had no professional network, and accepted a salary significantly below his qualifications, all to be near his mother's assisted living facility on the north side of Richmond, where Dolores Ashford was navigating the early stages of Parkinson's disease with the same quiet dignity her son had inherited. That was the story everyone at Meridian believed. The new analyst who'd taken a step down to care for family. Sympathetic. Unremarkable. Exactly the kind of person you stop paying attention to after the second week. They stopped paying attention. He didn't. Preston Voss was the first to test him directly, senior analyst. 7 years at Meridian. the kind of institutional memory that made him valuable, and the kind of ego that made him insufferable. Preston occupied the cubicle with the best sightline to the hallway, positioned to see who came and went, to comment on arrivals and departures, to exert the casual surveillance that passes for seniority in open-floor offices. On Nolan's third week, during a department meeting in the cramped conference room on 5, Preston interrupted a presentation Nolan was giving on updated regulatory filing requirements. "Where'd you say you went to school again?" The question had nothing to do with the content on screen. The room, 6 analysts, Janine, and a compliance manager named Ted who contributed nothing to meetings but his presence, shifted uncomfortably. "Georgetown. Georgetown." Preston repeated it the way someone might repeat the name of an unfamiliar restaurant, half curiosity, half skepticism. "Scholarship, right?" The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Nobody addressed it. Janine studied her phone. Ted examined the ceiling tile above his head as if it contained the answer to a question nobody had asked. "Merit-based admission, if that's what you're asking." Nolan's voice stayed level. "Should I continue with the presentation?" Preston waved a hand, a gesture that granted permission and dismissed significance simultaneously. Nolan continued. The meeting ended. Nobody mentioned the exchange afterward. Another data point, another entry in the leather notebook that went home every evening. The second month brought Brock Tillman into Nolan's orbit. Brock ran facilities and security, a title that gave him control over building access, parking assignments, conference room bookings, and the 1,000 small logistics that determine whether an employee's daily experience is functional or deliberately inconvenient. He was 6'2", 240, with the kind of physical presence that made hallways feel narrower. Former college linebacker, a fact he referenced with the regularity of someone whose best years happened 20 years ago, and who'd spent every year since trying to recapture the authority that came from being the largest person in the room. Nolan needed the small conference room on 5 for a client compliance call, a routine request handled through the building's online booking system. He submitted the request Monday morning for a Wednesday slot. By Tuesday afternoon, the system showed his booking had been canceled and reassigned to facilities' internal use. He walked to Brock's office on the second floor. Knocked. "Hey, Ashford?" Brock didn't look up from his computer. The office smelled like protein powder and stale energy drinks. "What do you need?" "The conference room I booked for Wednesday was reassigned. I have a client call scheduled." "Conference rooms are for revenue generators, bud." Now Brock looked up. The smile was friendly in the way that certain threats are friendly. Present, visible, completely without warmth. "I set up a folding table in the hallway by the break room. Should work fine for your call." A folding table, in a hallway, for a client-facing compliance review. "The client expects a professional setting. The booking system confirmed my reservation." "Systems glitch." Brock shrugged, a massive theatrical movement that used his entire upper body. "Talk to it if you want, but Wednesday's taken." Nolan left without argument. Made the call from his cubicle instead, which meant the conversation happened within earshot of 12 other employees and the copy machine. The client didn't complain. Brock's point was made regardless. Access, space, and basic professional infrastructure were privileges that could be revoked at will, and the person doing the revoking didn't need a reason. A week later, Nolan was walking to his car after a late evening finishing reports. The parking garage was mostly empty, 7:15 p.m., well past normal departure time. His footsteps echoed off concrete. Halfway to his vehicle, he felt it, that awareness of spatial change that comes from being watched. Brock stepped out from behind a support pillar, not blocking the path, not directly, but positioned so that the choice to walk around him would feel like the choice to walk around an obstacle, an acknowledgement of the other person's physical dominance. "Working late, Ashford?" "Reports due Friday." "Dedicated." Brock's arms crossed over his chest. In the fluorescent garage light, the gesture cast a shadow that reached Nolan's shoes. "You know, most new guys take a while to find their rhythm. Learn who to talk to, who to avoid, how things work around here." "I'm a fast learner." "That's so. Not a question." Some people learn fast. Some people think they learn fast, and then they trip over something they didn't see coming. He uncrossed his arms. Let them hang at his sides. Hands visible, posture relaxed, everything casual except the weight of the words. Just making sure you're settling in. That's all. He walked away. Nolan stood alone in the garage for 8 seconds, counted, then walked to his car, drove home, opened the notebook. Date, time, location, exact words, the position of Brock's body relative to the nearest security camera, which was angled to cover the driving lane, not the parking spaces. The blind spot was deliberate or habitual. Either way, it was documented. Month 3. The culture hardened. Company happy hours happened every other Friday at a bar 2 blocks from the office. The invitation went out via email to a distribution list that included every employee on floors 3 through 8. Nolan checked his inbox after the second event passed without his knowledge. He wasn't on the distribution list, had never been added. He mentioned this to Janine during their weekly one-on-one. She blinked, tilted her head. Oh, that's probably just an oversight. I'll mention it to Margot. The next happy hour came and went. No invitation. Team lunches followed the same pattern. The compliance department ate together on Wednesdays, a tradition that predated Nolan's arrival by years. Nolan learned about it by watching his colleagues leave in a group while he sat at his desk eating a sandwich he'd packed that morning. No one mentioned it. No one invited him. The absence wasn't hostile in any visible way. It was simply absolute, as if his desk existed in a parallel space that overlapped with the department but didn't connect to it. His birthday fell in month 4. He didn't expect a celebration. He was private about personal details and hadn't mentioned the date. But the employee handbook, section SAO, stated clearly, the Human Resources Department will coordinate birthday acknowledgments for all full-time employees, including a card signed by department colleagues and a cake in the break room during the employee's birth month. Every other birthday in the compliance department during Nolan's tenure received the prescribed treatment. Cards circulated. Cakes appeared. The break room smelled like frosting and obligatory camaraderie on the appropriate dates. Nolan's birthday passed in silence. No card, no cake, no acknowledgement. He verified the HR system had his correct birth date. It did, entered during onboarding by Margot Sinclair herself. Another data point. Another line in the notebook. 3 months at Meridian Capital, and the picture was assembling itself in the margins of those handwritten pages. Not dramatically, not with the clarity of a single damning event, but with the accumulating weight of 100 small exclusions, each one individually dismissible, collectively unmistakable. The kind of pattern that looks like coincidence if you're not tracking it and looks like strategy if you are. Nolan was tracking it. Month 4 changed the scope. The legacy audit files, the 3 bankers' boxes Janine had dropped on his desk with ceremonial indifference, contained 112 employee termination records from the 2021 restructuring. Nolan had read them all, cross-referenced them against organizational charts, performance reviews, and the firm's annual diversity reports, which were submitted to federal regulators and made available to shareholders. The pattern wasn't subtle. During the 2021 restructuring, 31 positions were eliminated. Of those, 22 had been held by employees identified as Black or Hispanic on the firm's own EEO MUT filings. White employees in identical roles, same titles, same departments, same compensation bands, had been retained and, in 11 cases, promoted to fill the vacated positions. The termination paperwork told one story. Position elimination due to strategic realignment. The performance reviews told another. Of the 22 minority employees terminated, 18 had received ratings of meets expectations or exceeds expectations in their most recent annual reviews signed by managers who then approved their removal 3 to 7 months later. Nolan drafted an internal compliance memo, 14 pages, single-spaced, with citations to the firm's own data and the applicable provisions of Title B of the Civil Rights Act. He routed it to Margot Sinclair per the company's internal reporting procedure, Section B, Chom Mote of the Employee Handbook. Compliance concerns shall be directed to the Human Resources Director for initial review and triage. Margot scheduled a meeting, then canceled it, rescheduled, canceled again. The third attempt, 2 weeks after the memo was submitted, produced a 15-minute conversation in Margot's office, during which she scanned the document at a speed that suggested she was reading headlines rather than content. "This is thorough work, Nolan. But these terminations were before your time. The restructuring was handled by outside counsel, and the decisions were reviewed and approved at the board level. The compliance implications aren't historical. If the pattern reflects discriminatory criteria, the firm has ongoing liability regardless of when the decisions were made." Margot closed the memo, set it on the corner of her desk, the corner closest to the recycling bin, a placement that might have been coincidental. "I'll flag it for review. In the meantime, I'd suggest focusing on current assignments. The Q3 audit is your priority." She walked him to the door. The memo, as far as Nolan could determine, was never flagged for anything. No follow-up meeting was scheduled. No acknowledgement was entered into the compliance tracking system. The 14-page document, with its citations, its data tables, its uncomfortable conclusions, simply ceased to exist in the firm's institutional awareness. 2 weeks later, Nolan filed a formal complaint through the Ethics and Compliance Hotline, the anonymous reporting mechanism described in Section B Chamba of the Employee Handbook as a confidential channel for employees to report concerns regarding ethical violations, discrimination, harassment, or regulatory non-compliance. The hotline guaranteed acknowledgement within 5 business days and investigation initiation within 15. 30 days passed. No acknowledgement, no case number, no contact from the hotline administrator, whose identity, Nolan would later discover, was Margot Sinclair. The hotline was a circle. Complaints entered it and arrived at the desk of the person responsible for the conditions generating the complaints. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Month 5. Nolan escalated. He filed a charge of discrimination with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the EEOC's Richmond local office, per the procedures outlined in 29 CFR, Section 1601 Chambay. The charge was specific: race-based disparate treatment in the 2021 restructuring, hostile work environment, and failure to investigate through internal reporting channels. He provided supporting documentation, copies of the legacy audit findings, the unanswered compliance memo, the hotline non-response. Under EEOC procedure, the agency sends a notice of charge to the employer within 10 days of filing. The notice informs the employer that a charge has been filed and initiates the response window, 30 days to submit a position statement. 3 weeks after filing, Nolan received no communication from Meridian acknowledging the charge. He contacted the EEOC Richmond office directly. The field officer confirmed. The notice of charge had been mailed certified to Meridian Capital Group, Attention Human Resources Director, on October 3rd. USPS tracking number ending 7429 showed delivery confirmed and signed for on October 7th. Recipient signature, M. Sinclair. Margot had signed for a federal notice of discrimination and buried it. No response was filed within the 30-day window. No position statement. No acknowledgement to Nolan. The charge entered what the EEOC calls administrative default. Not dismissed, but stalled, the kind of procedural limbo that benefits the employer and exhausts the complainant. In the leather notebook, the entry for that day was longer than most. 2 full pages. Dates. Tracking numbers. The EEOC field officer's name and direct extension. The certified mail receipt number. Every link in the chain of custody between a federal notice and the woman who'd signed for it and made it disappear. The retaliation began the same week. Garrett Caldwell called Nolan into his office on a Monday morning. Feet on the desk. Coffee mug that read "World's Best Boss." A gift from someone with either no irony or an extraordinary amount of it. "Close the door, Ashford." Nolan closed it. Remained standing. "I hear you've been asking questions about old terminations, poking around in files that aren't part of your current assignment. The legacy audit scope includes historical compliance patterns. Jeanine assigned those files as my onboarding project. Jeanine assigns busy work, so new hires don't sit around doing nothing for 3 weeks. Garrett took his feet off the desk, a gesture that, in his body language vocabulary, signaled the transition from casual to serious. "Let me give you some methodology, Ashford. This firm has operated for 26 years. We've never had a compliance issue we couldn't handle internally. You're here to check boxes, not rewrite history." The words carried the weight of a direct order delivered in the form of career advice. No witnesses, no HR representative present, no follow-up email, everything verbal, everything deniable. Nolan held the man's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to signal that he'd heard, short enough to avoid provocation. Then he nodded once and left. At his cubicle, he opened the notebook, wrote the date, the time, 9:47 a.m. Garrett's exact words, from memory, reconstructed in the order they were spoken. The absence of witnesses, the absence of documentation, the implicit instruction to abandon the audit findings. He closed the notebook, returned to his current assignment, said nothing to anyone. This is where most people would have given up. But what Nolan did next is the reason 43 people eventually got justice. Make sure you're subscribed. This story gets so much deeper. What happened over the next 12 months was not dramatic in the way stories typically are. There were no confrontations that ended in someone walking out, no speeches delivered in crowded rooms, no single moment where everything changed. Instead, there was accumulation, slow, relentless, documented, the way water wears stone, not by force, but by persistence. Margot Sinclair launched her campaign in month 6. It began with the Culture Fit Assessment, a new initiative, she explained to the department in an email that managed to sound both enthusiastic and threatening, designed to strengthen team cohesion and ensure alignment with Meridian's core values. Every employee would receive an evaluation measuring their integration into the firm's professional culture. Nolan's assessment arrived in his inbox on a Tuesday, completed and signed by Margot herself, which was unusual since the assessment form indicated it should be completed by the employee's direct supervisor, which was Jeanine Falk, not the HR director. The scores were devastating, not because they reflected reality, but because they reflected something else entirely. Cultural integration, 2 out of 10. Interpersonal engagement, 3 out of 10. Alignment with firm values, 2 out of 10. Professional collaboration, 3 out of 10. Overall culture fit, 2.5 out of 10. The comment section, in Margot's handwriting, read, "Employee demonstrates consistent reluctance to engage with team social functions, maintains guarded professional demeanor, and has shown resistance to collaborative feedback. Recommend performance improvement plan per section Bon Chambé." 3 other black employees received culture fit scores below 4. Every white employee in the department scored 7 or above. The correlation between score and race was absolute. Nolan obtained the other employees' scores through a conversation with Darnell Okafor, who'd received a 3.2 and was willing to share because he'd already started looking for another job. The third black employee, a woman named Keandra Ross in accounts receivable, had scored 2.8 and filed a complaint through the same ethics hotline that had swallowed Nolan's. Her complaint, like his, vanished into Margot's administrative void. The scoring system wasn't just discriminatory. It was engineered to produce a specific outcome: documentation that could justify adverse action against employees whose only measurable deficiency was the color of their skin. The culture fit assessment didn't evaluate culture. It weaponized it. 2 weeks after the assessments were distributed, Margot called a department meeting. Attendance mandatory. The topic: building a stronger Meridian family. She stood at the front of the conference room with a PowerPoint presentation that included stock photos of diverse professionals shaking hands, none of whom worked at Meridian, and spoke for 40 minutes about the importance of alignment, cohesion, and shared values. During the Q&A, Preston raised his hand. "Margot, should employees who scored below average on the culture fit be required to attend additional team-building sessions?" The question was directed at the room. The answer was directed at Nolan. "We're exploring options," Margot said. "Some employees may benefit from structured engagement opportunities." Nolan sat in the back row, said nothing, wrote the date, The time, Preston's question, and Margot's response in the notebook balanced on his knee. The pen moved with steady, unhurried strokes, the handwriting of someone who understood that patience was not passivity and silence was not surrender. The performance improvement plan arrived 2 weeks later. 90 days to demonstrate improvement in 4 areas: social engagement with colleagues, participation in firm culture events, receptiveness to supervisory feedback, and alignment with departmental norms. Not a single technical performance issue was cited. Not a single audit finding questioned. Not a single report returned for correction. They were disciplining him for not being invited to happy hours he wasn't told about, for not attending lunches he wasn't included in, for not celebrating a birthday the company had ignored. Nolan read the PIP in Margot's office, where she sat across from him with the practiced gravity of someone delivering bad news they'd engineered. "This is an opportunity, Nolan. 90 days to reset and show us you're part of the team." He signed the document, but in the margin, in neat block letters, he wrote, "I am signing to acknowledge receipt only, not agreement with the stated deficiencies. I reserve all rights under applicable federal and state law." Margot read the notation. Her pen pressed into the carbon copy hard enough to leave an impression through 3 pages. She said nothing. The meeting ended. Preston Voss escalated in month 8. The document tampering was systematic and precisely timed. Shared compliance reports that Nolan completed and saved to the firm's network drive were modified after hours. Key figures altered, citation numbers transposed, formatting corrupted, entire sections deleted. When the reports reached Garrett's desk for review, they appeared sloppy, incomplete, the work of someone struggling with basic competence. The first time it happened, Nolan assumed a software error. The second time, he checked the network drive's audit log, a feature most employees didn't know existed, accessible through the IT administrative panel that his Level 3 badge, corrected 11 days late, now permitted him to reach. The log was unambiguous. Document: Q-Bay Regulatory Compliance Summary. Original, save by user, N. Ashford, timestamp. September 12th, 4:17 p.m. File size 42 kilobytes. Modified by user. P. Voss, timestamp. September 12th, 11:43 p.m. File size 38 kilobytes. 4 pages deleted. 3 figures altered. No revision note logged. Preston had waited until nearly midnight to make the changes. The timing suggested premeditation, not an accidental overwrite, but a deliberate corruption performed when the building was empty and no one would see. Nolan didn't confront Preston, didn't report to Margot, who would bury it, or to Garrett, who would dismiss it. Instead, he began saving time-stamped PDF copies of every document to an encrypted personal drive every evening before leaving. The originals, the modified versions, the audit logs showing who changed what and when. Every alteration cataloged. Over the next 3 months, Preston modified 14 documents. 12 of the modifications occurred after business hours. Total pages altered, 47. Not one modification improved the content. Every change made Nolan's work appear less competent. The client presentation ambush came in month 10. Preston arranged for Nolan to present quarterly compliance findings to a visiting client, Whitfield National Bank, a mid-tier institutional partner whose account represented significant revenue. The presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. Wednesday. Nolan prepared for 2 weeks. At 9:31 a.m., 30 minutes before the meeting, Nolan opened the presentation file from the shared drive. The slides on screen bore no resemblance to the deck he'd built. His version, current data, accurate citations, risk analysis specific to Whitfield's portfolio, had been replaced with an older template containing outdated regulatory references and figures from 2 quarters prior. The conference room filled. Whitfield's team took their seats. Garrett settled into the back row, arms crossed, posture that said observation but meant judgment. Preston sat beside him, notepad out, pen ready, the posture of someone preparing to document failure. Nolan stood at the front of the room. The wrong slides glowed behind him on the projection screen. He had two choices: attempt to present incorrect information or admit the file had been compromised, which would look like an excuse, regardless of its truth. He chose a third option. He closed the laptop. The screen went dark. The room shifted. 12 people recalculating their expectations in the silence that followed the click. My apologies for the technical difficulty. I'll present without slides today. What followed was 45 minutes of regulatory analysis delivered from memory, not just data, framework, the specific federal requirements applicable to Whitfield's institutional structure, citation numbers for relevant SEC provisions, risk thresholds calibrated to the client's portfolio composition, mitigation strategies mapped to their compliance calendar. Every figure, every reference, every recommendation spoken with the fluency of someone who hadn't memorized a presentation but understood the underlying architecture well enough to reconstruct it in real time. The Whitfield team leaned forward. Their general counsel, a woman named Ruth Emery, who'd spent 22 years in securities regulation, took notes continuously. When Nolan finished, she set her pen down. That was one of the most precise regulatory presentations I've heard outside of federal briefings. The compliment hung in the air. Garrett's arms uncrossed. Preston's notepad stayed blank. He'd been prepared to document failure, not competence, and the absence of anything to write left his pen suspended over empty paper. "Thank you," Nolan said. "I try to be thorough." He returned to his cubicle, opened the notebook, documented the slide swap, original file timestamp, replacement file timestamp, the audit log entry he'd checked that evening. Then he wrote Ruth Emery's comment verbatim, not because it was evidence, it was, but because in 10 months at Meridian Capital, it was the first time someone in a position of authority had acknowledged his capability without qualification. The fallout from the presentation was immediate. Garrett caught Nolan in the hallway outside the conference room, 20 minutes after the Whitfield team had left. The corridor was empty. Lunch hour. Most employees gone. Garrett's hand landed on Nolan's shoulder from behind, heavy enough to stop his forward motion. "Impressive performance in there, Ashford." Nolan turned. Garrett's face held a smile that wasn't one, the expression of someone recalibrating a threat assessment. "Just doing my job." "See, that's the thing." Garrett's hand stayed on Nolan's shoulder. The grip tightened incrementally. Not painful, but possessive. The physical equivalent of a sentence that starts with, "Let me be clear." His voice dropped to the register reserved for conversations that couldn't survive witnesses. "Your job is to do what Jeanine assigns, to present what we approve, to say what the slides say, not whatever's in your head. This isn't a one-man show." "The slides were corrupted. I adapted." "You showed off, in front of a client, made the rest of the team look unprepared." The grip released. Garrett straightened Nolan's collar, a gesture that looked paternal from a distance and felt invasive up close. "Ruth Emery called my office afterward, asked for you by name, asked if we could assign you as Whitfield's dedicated compliance liaison." The compliment, delivered through Garrett's jaw like something stuck in his teeth, carried its own threat. A client requesting a specific employee undermined Garrett's control of the account relationship, which undermined his authority, which was the only currency he respected. "I told her that wouldn't be possible. Restructuring. You're on a different trajectory." "Understood." "Good." Garrett walked away. 3 steps, then over his shoulder. "And Ashford, next time there's a client presentation, you use the approved materials, period." Nolan stood in the empty hallway, wrote the conversation in the notebook that evening, the shoulder grab, the collar adjustment, the direct instruction to suppress competence to protect ego, another receipt for the archive that grew thicker with each passing month. 2 days later, Preston made his frustration physical. Nolan was at his desk reviewing a report when Preston appeared at the cubicle entrance, flushed, jaw tight, radiating the particular anger of someone whose sabotage had failed publicly. "That presentation stunt, you think you're clever." "I think the client got accurate information." Preston stepped into the cubicle, a space not designed for 2 people. His hand swept across Nolan's desk, scattering papers, sending the coffee mug spinning toward the edge. Nolan caught the mug. The papers fell. 3 colleagues in adjacent cubicles looked up, looked away. "Accidents happen in open offices," Preston said. His breathing was audible, short, controlled, the exertion of restraint masking the desire for escalation. "Be more careful with your workspace." He left. Nolan picked up the papers, rearranged them, wrote the incident down, date, time, witnesses who'd looked away, the direction of Preston's hand sweep, the scattered documents. The notebook was filling its 2nd volume now. The entries had shifted from clinical to comprehensive, not just what happened, but the architecture around it. Who saw, who turned away, who benefited from silence. Jeanine Falk made her move in month 11. The fabricated complaint appeared in Nolan's personnel file without warning. Internal complaint form IC Gach Noi Hai, Kong Hai Bon Get Noi Kong Kong Tambai, filed by Jeanine Falk, alleging that Nolan had made inappropriate and demeaning comments during a team meeting on an unspecified date. The complaint named no witnesses, quoted no specific language, provided no date, time, or context. Margot treated it as substantiated. A note was added to Nolan's personnel file. Employee placed under observation following internal complaint regarding conduct, HR monitoring in effect. Nolan requested a copy of the complaint per Virginia Code Section Hai Cham Hai Gach Noi Ba Chin Kong Num, which grants employees the right to review their personnel records within 5 business days of a written request. He submitted the request on November 8th. The response arrived November 28th. 14 business days later, 9 days past the statutory deadline. The document provided was partially redacted, sections 2, 4, and 6 blacked out, with the justification listed as confidential complainant protection. But the complaint form itself noted, in a field visible beneath the redaction, that no complainant interview had been conducted. Jeanine had filed it. Margot had accepted it. No one had investigated whether the alleged comments had actually occurred, because they hadn't. Nolan reviewed his own calendar for the month the complaint referenced. He'd attended 3 team meetings. Each one had been routine. Each one had included at least 4 other employees. None of those employees were contacted as witnesses. None were asked to corroborate or deny the allegations. A complaint with no date, no witnesses, no investigation, and a response that violated state law on personnel record access. Nolan added the redacted document to his archive. The following week, the confrontation turned physical again. Nolan was photocopying documents in the copy room, a small windowless space barely large enough for the machine and one person, when Jeanine appeared in the doorway. "Those the audit files?" "Quarterly reports." "I need the copier." "I'll be finished in 2 minutes." Jeanine didn't wait. She reached past him, close enough that her elbow connected with his ribs, hard enough that the contact couldn't be mistaken for accident, and pressed the cancel button on the machine. His copies halted mid-run. "My documents have priority." Nolan stepped back. The copy room's dimensions made avoidance difficult, 3 paces by 4, with the machine occupying most of the usable space. Jeanine had positioned herself between him and the doorway. "Jeanine, I have 2 pages left. And I have a deadline." She fed her papers into the tray without looking at him. Her elbow had left a bruise he'd find that evening, small, circular, the precise shape of a bone driven into soft tissue with deliberate force. He left the copy room, retrieved his incomplete copies later, wrote the incident in the notebook, the contact, the location, the positioning that blocked the exit, the canceled print job. He did not file a complaint. Filing complaints at Meridian Capital was an exercise in documentation, not resolution. He documented instead. The notebook was more reliable than the system. Nolan filed a second EEOC charge, this one adding retaliation under Bon Mui Hai USC section, Haingen Eget Neuba to the original discrimination claim. This time, he filed in person at the EEOC Richmond office, obtained a stamped receipt with the case number, and instructed the field office to send the notice of charge via both certified mail and email to Meridian Capital's registered legal agent, not to Margot Sinclair's office. The notice reached outside counsel Boyd Landon within the week. Landon contacted Nolan directly. Brief, professional, the tone of an attorney who understood the significance of a second EEOC charge filed by the same employee within 6 months. "We take these matters seriously, Mr. Ashford. The company will respond within the statutory window." The response, filed 29 days later, 1 day before the deadline, denied all allegations and attached Nolan's PIP and Jeanine's fabricated complaint as evidence of legitimate, non-discriminatory performance management. The legal strategy was transparent. Reframe discrimination as performance. Reframe retaliation as process. Paper the file with enough documentation to create plausible deniability. Boyd Landon was competent. The defense would look reasonable to anyone who examined only the documents Meridian chose to present. It would look very different to anyone who examined the documents Meridian didn't know existed. The time-stamped backups, the audit logs, the intercepted EEOC notice, the statistical analysis of the culture fit assessment, the notebook entries spanning 14 months of systematic exclusion. But that examination was still months away. Month 15 brought the parking garage. Late evening, January. The garage was cold enough that Nolan's breath formed small clouds under the fluorescent lights. The compliance department's Q4 reports were due Friday, and he'd stayed past 7 to finalize 2 sections that Preston would likely tamper with before Monday. He'd already saved the time-stamped backups. His footsteps echoed, then stopped. Because standing between him and the driver's side door of his car, not accidentally, not coincidentally, but with the deliberate positioning of someone who'd chosen this spot and this moment, was Brock Tillman. "Heard you've been talking to outside lawyers, Ashford." Nolan measured the distance, 14 feet. Security camera mounted on the ceiling pillar, angled to cover the driving lane, not the parking spaces. The blind spot extended roughly 8 feet in each direction from where Brock stood. He knew the angles. He'd documented them 3 months ago. "I talk to a lot of people, Brock." "Some people you shouldn't talk to." Brock stepped closer, 5 feet now. His breath was visible too. Larger clouds, heavier exhalation, the physical presence of a man who understood that size was its own kind of argument. "Some conversations should stay inside the family. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand you're blocking my vehicle." Brock reached out. His hand closed around Nolan's forearm. Not a grip that would leave bruises, but firm enough that pulling away would require visible effort, would create a physical struggle in a space with no witnesses and no functional camera coverage. "Let go of my arm." "Just making a point, Ashford." The grip tightened for 2 seconds, then released. Brock stepped back, hands raised in mock innocence. "Drive safe. Lots of accidents on these roads." He walked toward the elevator. Nolan stood still until the footsteps faded. Then he walked to his car, sat in the driver's seat, let his hands shake for 30 seconds. He allowed himself that. 30 seconds of being human. 30 seconds of acknowledging that a man significantly larger than him had just grabbed him in a dark garage with the implicit promise of worse to come. Then the calm returned. He drove home, opened the notebook. Date, January 14th. Time, 7:22 p.m. Location, Meridian Capital Parking Garage, Level High, Section C, spaces 41 through 44. Security camera, Bongach Noi C. Covers driving lane only. Blind spot in parking area. Physical contact. Brock Tillman grabbed subject's left forearm, held approximately 3 seconds. Direct quote, "Some conversations should stay inside the family." Additional quote, "Drive safe. Lots of accidents on these roads." Month 17. The stairwell. Nolan had stopped using the elevator after the 3rd time security camera maintenance logs showed the elevator camera offline for repair. He'd checked with the building's maintenance vendor. No work orders existed for the elevator camera during those outage periods. Someone inside the firm was creating blind spots on demand. The stairwell between floors 4 and 3 had its own camera. Camera Bongach Noi B, which the maintenance log showed had been listed offline on 7 separate dates since December. 7 dates. No corresponding repair orders. 7 opportunities for conversations that couldn't be recorded. On March 6th, Nolan pushed through the stairwell door on 4 and found Brock Tillman and Preston Voss waiting on the landing between floors. Not a coincidence. The stairwell was empty. Camera Bon Gak Noi B was, according to the log, offline since that morning. "Just a friendly conversation," Brock said. His voice echoed off concrete walls, amplified by the enclosed space. Preston held a manila folder. His expression was the particular blend of righteousness and cowardice that characterized people who brought muscle to a conversation because their words alone weren't enough. "This is your resignation letter," Preston said, opening the folder to reveal a single typed page. Pre-typed. Effective immediately. You sign it, you get 2 months severance, a neutral reference, and this all goes away. Nolan kept his back to the wall, both men in his sight line. The stairwell door behind him, closed but not locked. "And if I don't sign?" Brock cracked his knuckles. The sound bounced off concrete like a gunshot in miniature. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Preston said. He extended the folder toward Nolan. A gesture that looked like an offering, but felt like a shove. When Nolan didn't reach for it, Brock moved. 2 steps. Fast for a man his size. His hand hit Nolan's chest, open-palmed, not a punch, but a push that drove Nolan's shoulder blades into the cinder block wall. The impact knocked air from his lungs. "Sign the paper, Ashford." Nolan's voice came out compressed but steady. "Take your hand off me." "Or what?" "Or the lawsuit names you personally, not just Meridian. You." Virginia Code Section 18.257, Assault and Battery. Civil liability under Section Tamcham Khomot Get Noi Bonmui Hai. And whatever severance you're offering won't cover your legal fees when a jury sees the security camera log showing this camera has been conveniently offline 7 times in 3 months. Brock's hand stayed on Nolan's chest for 4 more seconds. Nolan felt the pressure, the weight of it, the message in it, the calculation happening behind Brock's eyes as he measured the threat of legal consequences against the satisfaction of violence. The hand dropped. "Your call," Brock said. He stepped back. Preston closed the folder, jaw tight with the frustration of a plan that had been refused rather than executed. Nolan straightened his shirt, walked through the stairwell door, took the elevator, camera or no camera, to the lobby, left the building. In his car, his hands shook again. This time he allowed himself 60 seconds. Month 18. The end. Garrett's office. 9 a.m. on a Monday. Margot present in the chair to Garrett's left. Boyd Landon's voice coming through the speakerphone on the desk, tinny and precise, the sound of legal liability being managed from a safe distance. "We're eliminating the senior compliance analyst position due to departmental restructuring," Garrett said. The words were polished, rehearsed, delivered with the same casual authority he used for everything, as if firing someone were no different from approving a lunch order. "Your last day is today, 2 weeks severance, benefits through end of month." The termination letter lay on the desk between them. Nolan read it without picking it up. Stated reason: position elimination due to departmental restructuring. Effective date: March 1st. "I'd like a copy of this letter for my records." "Of course." Margot slid a second copy across the desk. "And for the record, Meridian's careers page currently lists an open position for Senior Compliance Analyst, Richmond office, posted February 28th. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Garrett looked at Margot. Margot looked at the speakerphone. Boyd Landon's breathing was audible through the speaker, the sound of outside counsel recalculating exposure. "That posting is for a different role," Margot said. "Different scope. Same title, same department, same job description. Posted 3 days before this meeting." "Mr. Ashford," Boyd Landon's voice came through careful and measured. "The company's restructuring decisions are made at the executive level based on business needs. The specifics of any job posting are an internal matter." "Understood." Nolan stood. "I'll collect my personal items." He packed the cardboard box in 12 minutes. His cubicle held very little. The firm had never provided a nameplate, and the leather notebooks had gone home every night for 18 months. He placed his access badge on the desk, took his coffee mug, left the company laptop. Brock Tillman appeared as Nolan reached the elevator, falling into step beside him with the casual authority of someone performing an official function. "I'll walk you out." The walk through the lobby was designed to be seen. Brock kept one hand on Nolan's elbow, light enough to be guidance, firm enough to be control. Employees at their desks looked up. Some looked away quickly. Others watched with the careful attention of people calculating whether what they were witnessing could happen to them. At the front door, Brock gave Nolan's elbow a squeeze, a final assertion of physical authority, a punctuation mark on 18 months of institutional dominance. "Take care of yourself, Ashford." Nolan pulled his arm free, said nothing, walked through the glass doors into the March sunlight. Behind him, through the lobby windows, he could see employees returning to their screens. The receptionist whose smile had cooled on his first morning didn't look up. The diversity statement in its aluminum frame caught the light. 6 smiling faces, none of whom worked here, none of whom had been fired for being the wrong color in a building that celebrated sameness and called it culture. Nolan walked to his car, set the box in the passenger seat. His phone buzzed. A text from Darnell Okafor. "Just heard. I'm sorry. They told us at the 10 a.m. meeting, restructuring." A pause, then, "They posted your job already, didn't they?" Nolan typed, "February 28th, 3 days ago." Darnell's reply, 3 dots, typing, then nothing. The message was never completed. Nolan understood. Speaking up cost things at Meridian. Darnell had a mortgage and a daughter starting college in the fall. Silence wasn't betrayal. It was survival arithmetic, the kind of calculation black professionals make every day in spaces where the floor can disappear without warning. Nolan sat behind the wheel, looked at the building one last time, glass and steel reflecting the March sun, the firm's name in brushed metal above the entrance, the diversity statement visible through the lobby window. Then he drove home. And for the first time in 18 months, he didn't open the notebook. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be written was already written. Everything that needed to be documented was documented. 18 months of dates, times, names, quotes, receipts, audit logs, camera angles, badge codes, EEOC filings, and the careful, meticulous, exhaustive record of a system that thought it was punishing someone powerless and never once considered the possibility that it was being watched. 4 months later, the invitation arrived. He stood at the kitchen counter, read it twice, set it beside his mother's medication bottles, and smiled. The archive covered the kitchen table in organized rows. 3 leather notebooks, filled, every page, both sides. Printed emails obtained through his personal accounts forwarded copies. Screenshots of the Meridian Careers page, time-stamped. PDF comparisons showing original documents beside Preston's corrupted versions. The culture fit assessment forms, his and the 3 other black employees, all scoring below 4 beside the scores of white employees, none below 7. Jeanine's fabricated complaint with its missing witnesses and violated response timeline. The EEOC filings, both of them, with certified mail receipts and stamped case numbers. The security camera maintenance log with 7 offline dates and 0 repair orders, and the termination letter, beside the job posting screenshot, dated 3 days apart. Same title, same department, same description. The firm's own website contradicting its own stated reason for firing him. Nolan spread the documents in chronological order. 18 months compressed to table length, every entry time-stamped, every receipt verified. Every line in the notebook corresponding to a corroborating document. He read them aloud, not for an audience, but for accuracy, the way someone reads evidence before filing it. EEOC charge number num hai không get noi, hai không hai bon get noi, không một tam bon bay. Filed August 14th. Notice of charge mailed certified to Meridian Capital Group, attention Human Resources Director Margot Sinclair. Delivery confirmed October 7th. Signed for by M. Sinclair. No company response filed within 30-day statutory window. Charge status, default. Internal email. Meridian Capital HR server. From M. Sinclair to G. Caldwell. Subject, Ashford situation. Date, October 12th. Body, received some federal mail regarding Ashford. Handled, filed under general correspondence. No action needed. Forwarded to J. Falk same day with annotation. Start building the paper trail. IT access log. User P. Voss modified 14 documents authored by user N. Ashford between September and January. 12 modifications occurred after business hours. None logged in revision tracking system. Total pages altered, 47. Meridian Capital Security Camera Maintenance Log. Camera Bonget Noi B. Stairwell. Floors 3 and 4. Listed offline for repair on 7 separate dates between December and February. Maintenance vendor contacted. No work orders exist for Camera Bonget Noi B during that period. Personnel file access request. Submitted, November 8th. Virginia Human Rights Act Section Hai Chum Hai. Get Noi Ba Chin Kong Num requires employer response within 5 business days. Response received November 28th, 14 business days late. Document provided with sections 2, 4, and 6 redacted. Redaction, justification, confidential complainant protection. Internal notation visible beneath redaction. No complainant interview conducted. He set the documents down. The table looked like a case file because it was one. Not the kind assembled by prosecutors or investigators. The kind assembled by someone inside the system, watching, recording, waiting for the moment when documentation became leverage and patience became strategy. The gala invitation sat at the end of the row. Gold lettering, embossed crest, former employee recognition, table 14, near the service entrance. Nolan opened his laptop, an encrypted email program, not Gmail, not Outlook, something more secure, the kind of platform that routes through servers designed to protect both sender and recipient. He typed an address ending in USD OJChamGOV. Subject line, Meridian Capital, timeline accelerated. Recommend presenting preliminary findings at location, date of gala. All 43 complainants notified. Evidence package complete. He hit send. 14 minutes later, the reply arrived. 3 words and a title. Approved. Coordinate with EEOC Richmond. Formal notice to company counsel to be served day of. Good work, counselor. Counselor. The word sat on the screen like a key to a door that had been locked for 18 months. A word that meant something specific in legal contexts, a form of address reserved for attorneys, an acknowledgement of standing, of authority, of the right to act on behalf of others. The people at Meridian Capital had called him Ashford, Noel, Noland, Bud, New Guy, Bodies. They'd called him everything except what he was. They were about to find out. Nolan picked up the RSVP card, checked the box, will attend, added a +1, slid it into the return envelope, set it aside for mailing. But the scope of what was coming required context that Nolan's kitchen table couldn't fully contain. His charge wasn't an isolated event. It was the 43rd. 43 charges of discrimination filed against Meridian Capital Group between 2019 and 2024, 31 by former employees identifying as Black or Hispanic, 27 alleging racial discrimination in termination, 14 alleging retaliation for protected activity. The EEOC's Richmond office had tracked these charges across 5 years, watching the numbers accumulate the way a physician watches lab results decline. Each individual reading concerning, the aggregate alarming. The referral to the Department of Justice triggered something larger than any single complainant could have initiated alone. Under Bon Mui Hai, USC. Section Hai Ngin Eget Noi Sao, the Attorney General can bring a pattern or practice suit when evidence suggests systemic discrimination, not isolated incidents, not individual bad actors, but institutional behavior so consistent and widespread that it constitutes a pattern embedded in the organization's operations. Meridian Capital didn't have a discrimination problem. Meridian Capital was a discrimination problem. And 43 people, 43 separate filings, 43 individuals who'd walked into the EEOC office with their own stories of being pushed out, passed over, degraded and discarded, had collectively built the foundation for the kind of federal action that transforms companies or destroys them. Nolan knew the number because it had been his job to know, not his job at Meridian. His real job. The one that existed before the compliance cubicle, before the leather notebooks, before 18 months of being called by the wrong name in a building that was never going to promote him. But that revelation, who he really was, what he really did, why a man with his qualifications would accept a position 3 levels below his capability, remained sealed. The gala was 3 weeks away. The reveal would happen there, in the venue Garrett Caldwell had chosen as the stage for his cruelty, transformed into the setting for his undoing. Nolan spent those 3 weeks in preparation that looked nothing like the work he'd done at Meridian. The kitchen table became a staging area. Documents reorganized by legal theory, sorted by the framework federal courts require for pattern or practice claims. Statistical analysis of termination rates by race. Comparative performance evaluations showing identical work product scored differently based on demographics. The email chains that proved coordination. Margot's "start building the paper trail" message. Garrett's verbal instruction to cease the audit. On a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks before the gala, he drove to the EEOC Richmond office. The field officer, a woman who'd processed both of his charges and watched 41 others accumulate before them, confirmed the timeline. Everything's in order. The notice of intent goes out day of, served on company counsel at the venue. All complainants notified? All 43, 28 confirmed cooperation, 11 pending, 4 declined. They've moved on. She paused. Can't blame them. No, you can't. Then he drove to see his mother. The assisted living facility on Richmond's north side smelled like linen and the faint medicinal undertone that all such places carry regardless of how well they're maintained. Dolores Ashford sat in the common room by the window, watching birds at the feeder outside. Cardinals and sparrows, their movements quick and purposeful against the late afternoon light. "You look tired," she said when he sat down. "Long day. That job of yours working you too hard?" "I'm between things right now, Mama." She studied him, the way mothers do, with an attention that cuts through evasion to the thing underneath. Her hands trembled slightly, the Parkinson's making its presence known in the small muscles first, but her eyes were clear, sharp, the eyes of a woman who'd raised a son alone in a city that offered her nothing and watched him walk into rooms she'd never been allowed to enter. Between things, she repeated it like she was testing the taste of the words. "That's what your father used to say when he was planning something." Nolan held her hand. Didn't answer. A woman passed in the hallway. Another visitor, older, black, well-dressed in a way that suggested professional life maintained into retirement. She stopped when she saw Nolan. Recognition crossed her face, slow, then certain. "Mr. Ashford." The name, delivered with weight, with the kind of quiet respect that goes beyond politeness into something closer to acknowledgement, made Nolan look up. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "Not directly. My daughter worked at Meridian Capital. 2 years ago. Same department you were in." The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I heard what happened to you. Same thing happened to her. We filed a complaint, but nothing came of it. Someone told us to be patient, that the right people were watching." She paused. Her eyes held Nolan's with an intensity that made the common room feel smaller. "I didn't believe it then." She studied his face. Whatever she found there, recognition, maybe, or confirmation of something she'd suspected, shifted her expression from cautious to certain. "I'm starting to believe it now." Nolan held her hand. The gesture was gentle, deliberate, the kind of contact that communicates more than words in spaces where words carry risk. He said nothing that would reveal anything, nothing that could be repeated in a way that would compromise what was coming. Just, "Tell your daughter to keep her record safe." The woman nodded, squeezed his hand once, walked away. Dolores watched the exchange with the quiet attention she brought to everything. She didn't ask who the woman was, didn't ask what the conversation meant. She knew her son, knew the silences he kept, Knew that whatever he was planning, he'd tell her when it was time and not before. "Nolan?" "Yes, Mama." "Whatever it is, be careful." "Always." She turned back to the birds. He sat with her until the light changed, until the cardinals left the feeder and the sparrows settled into the tree line for the evening, until the silence between them felt less like absence and more like the particular kind of peace that exists between people who trust each other completely and need no words to prove it. Then he drove home, mailed the RSVP, set his alarm for 6 a.m. 3 weeks until the gala. In those 3 weeks, Nolan did something he hadn't done in 18 months at Meridian Capital. He stopped being invisible. Not publicly, not in any way that would alert Garrett or Margot or anyone else at the firm. But within the network of 43 complainants, within the corridors of the EEOC Richmond office and the federal building where his real colleagues worked, Nolan Ashford re-emerged from the cover identity he'd maintained for a year and a half. He spent the first week finalizing the evidence package, every document cross-referenced, every receipt verified against its source, every entry in the leather notebooks matched to a corroborating file, an email, a screenshot, an audit log, a time-stamped PDF. The chain of custody was meticulous. It had to be. Pattern or practice cases under Bon Muy High USC. Section Hingin Agat Noi So faced intense scrutiny from defense counsel who would challenge every exhibit, question every timeline, and attempt to characterize systematic discrimination as coincidental personnel decisions. The statistical analysis alone took 3 days. Termination rates broken down by race, department, and year. Performance review scores plotted against outcomes, showing that black employees who received exceeds expectations ratings were terminated at 4 times the rate of white employees with identical scores. Compensation data revealing that the 3 black analysts hired during Nolan's tenure were paid between 11 and 14% below the departmental median for equivalent positions. Numbers don't lie, but they don't speak for themselves either. They need someone to read them aloud in the right room to the right audience with enough authority that the people being exposed can't dismiss the messenger. Nolan spent the second week coordinating with the EEOC and preparing the Notice of Intent to Sue. The document was 37 pages. Every page a brick in the wall that was closing around Meridian Capital's executive suite. He reviewed it 4 times. His co-counsel, Adrienne Calloway, reviewed it twice more. They argued over 3 paragraphs. Revised 2. Kept the 3rd unchanged because the language was already precise enough to survive judicial review. The 3rd week was quiet. Nolan visited his mother twice. Did laundry. Went running along the James River in the early morning, watching the city wake up from the footpath that wound through the park below the skyline. He ate meals at regular hours, slept 7 hours a night. The discipline wasn't new. It was the same discipline that had carried him through law school, through the bar exam, through the years of federal litigation that had made him very good at a job nobody at Meridian Capital knew he held. On the night before the gala, he laid out his suit. Charcoal, not black. Professional without being funereal. Good cut, good fabric. The kind of clothes he wore to federal courthouses, not to cubicles next to copy rooms. He checked his phone. 1 text from Adrienne. Portfolio packed, see you at 7. 1 text from Darnell Okafor. Still at Meridian, still silent, still surviving. Heard you RSVP'd to the gala. You okay? Nolan typed, better than okay. Darnell's reply, be careful. That word again, be careful. His mother had said it. Now Darnell. People who cared about him issuing the same warning from different corners of his life, as if carefulness were the thing that would protect him. As if the danger were ahead and not 18 months behind. In the parking garage where Brock grabbed his arm, in the stairwell where Brock shoved him against a wall, in the copy room where Janine's elbow left a bruise, in the office where Garrett straightened his collar like he owned the body underneath it. Nolan set the phone down, turned off the light, lay in the dark thinking about 43 people whose names he'd memorized, whose stories he'd read, whose complaints had been filed and buried and ignored until the weight of accumulation became too heavy for even the most indifferent system to bear. Tomorrow, he'd walk into a ballroom designed for celebration and turn it into something else entirely. Not revenge. He'd lost his taste for revenge somewhere around month 6, when the anger had burned itself down to something harder and more useful: conviction. The belief that documentation matters, that procedure matters, that the difference between complaint and accountability is evidence, and the difference between evidence and justice is someone willing to present it in a room where power can't look away. He closed his eyes. Set his alarm for 6 a.m. The gala started at 7 p.m. By 8:15, the world Garrett Caldwell had built would begin to collapse. But that's a story for part 2. The alarm went off at 6 a.m. Nolan Ashford got out of bed, made coffee, opened his laptop, and reviewed the 37-page document that would end careers before dessert was served. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button, because what happens at that gala is something no one in that room will ever forget. Part 2 drops tomorrow, and trust me, you are not ready. The coffee grew cold on the counter. The laptop screen glowed with the blue-white light of federal document templates. Outside, Richmond woke up, traffic building on the interstate, the sun climbing above the river, the city going about its business without knowing that somewhere in a one-bedroom apartment on the north side, a man who'd spent 18 months being called the wrong name was about to introduce himself properly. And when he did, every person who'd touched that Slack message, every laughing emoji, every thumbs up, every casual cruelty typed without consequence, would learn what Nolan Ashford had known since the day he'd accepted that mid-level compliance job at a firm with 42 pending discrimination complaints. Number 43 was never a victim. He was the case. The Jefferson Hotel had hosted Richmond's powerful since 1895. Crystal chandeliers, marble columns, the kind of architecture that communicates permanence, the suggestion that the people inside its walls belong to something larger and older than themselves. On the evening of March 22nd, the grand ballroom was dressed in Meridian Capital's navy and gold, banners bearing the firm's crest hanging from brass fixtures, the string quartet warming up in the corner near a bar that cost more per hour than most of the firm's entry-level employees earned in a week. 300 guests filtered through the lobby, executives in tailored suits, their partners in evening wear, clients whose presence was both social obligation and business strategy. Board members arrived in town cars. Local politicians arrived in their own vehicles, but parked in the VIP section, a distinction that communicated exactly the kind of access Meridian's annual donations purchased. Garrett Caldwell stood near the ballroom entrance in a midnight blue suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who believe clothing is a form of authority. He greeted arrivals with handshakes calibrated to each person's value, firm and sustained for board members, brief and dismissive for mid-level staff, warm and lingering for anyone whose name appeared on the client revenue report. Margot Sinclair worked the room beside him, her dress a shade of silver that caught the chandelier light. She carried a tablet showing the seating chart, her creation, her hierarchy made visible in table assignments that placed power near the stage and irrelevance near the service entrance. Table 14 sat against the back wall, between the kitchen doors and the corridor leading to the restrooms. 2 place settings, 2 chairs, a centerpiece identical to every other table's but positioned so that anyone seated there would face the backs of 300 heads, their view of the stage partially blocked by a structural column. The placement was deliberate. The cruelty was the point. At 6:58 p.m., Nolan Ashford walked through the Jefferson Hotel's front entrance. The suit was charcoal, not black, not dramatic, the color of someone who dressed for federal courtrooms rather than corporate galas. The cut was different from anything Meridian's employees had seen him wear. Sharper at the shoulders, tailored at the waist, the fit of clothes chosen by someone who understood that appearance in professional settings communicates jurisdiction. He moved through the lobby with a posture his former colleagues wouldn't have recognized. Not the hunched compliance of a man navigating a hostile office, but the measured stride of someone arriving at a destination he'd chosen. His +1 walked beside him. Adrienne Calloway. Mid-40s, black, her hair in a low twist, her suit jacket structured enough to conceal the leather portfolio she carried. A portfolio that contained, among other documents, a 37-page notice of intent to sue on behalf of the United States of America. They checked in at the registration table. A young woman in a Meridian-branded polo scanned the guest list, found his name, and handed over 2 badges. The badges read Former Employee Recognition in smaller font than the executive badges. Another small humiliation engineered into the logistics. Nolan clipped the badge to his lapel without comment. Adrian did the same. They found table 14, sat down. The kitchen doors swung open and closed behind them at irregular intervals, releasing bursts of heat and the clatter of plates being stacked. The structural column blocked exactly 40% of the stage, enough to make the positioning feel accidental to anyone who didn't understand interior architecture, obvious to anyone who did. Nolan unfolded his napkin, placed it on his lap, looked at Adrienne. "Ready?" she asked. 18 months ready." Across the ballroom, Garrett spotted the arrival, nudged Margot with his elbow, a gesture that carried the satisfaction of a man watching his own joke land. He actually came. Garrett's smile widened into something that resembled delight and wasn't. "Table 14, right where we put him." Margot glanced toward the back wall. The distance was considerable. The ballroom seated 300, but Nolan was visible, sitting upright, napkin placed, his companion beside him, both of them looking remarkably comfortable for people assigned to the worst seats in the room. "Who's the woman with him?" Margot asked. "Who cares?" Garrett turned back to the arriving board chairman, Lawrence Pratt, whose handshake he'd been waiting all evening to receive. He brought a date to his own humiliation. That's almost impressive. Garrett made the rounds. From table 14, Nolan watched him work the room. The handshakes, the backslaps, the way he leaned into conversations with the practiced intimacy of someone who understood that physical proximity was a form of power. At table 3, Garrett paused beside Preston Voss and said something that made Preston glance toward the back of the room. Both men laughed. The sound didn't carry, but the direction of their attention was unmistakable. At table 7, Garrett stopped beside Brock Tillman, present tonight as head of security, stationed near the ballroom entrance with a radio earpiece, and the particular authority of someone whose job description gave him jurisdiction over everybody in the room. Garrett leaned in. Brock's eyes found table 14. He nodded. The nod carried professional acknowledgement, confirmation that the security team was aware of the former employee's presence and prepared to intervene if the evening's entertainment produced discomfort rather than amusement. Nolan cataloged each interaction. Not in the leather notebook, that was in federal evidence storage now, but mentally, with the same precision he'd applied for 18 months. Garrett conferring with Preston. Garrett briefing Brock. Margot circulating among the board members' wives, her smile deployed like camouflage, her tablet still tracking the evening's logistics. At 7:20, Garrett approached table 14 directly. The handshake was offered with the particular condescension of someone extending courtesy to a person they've already dismissed. Nolan took it. The grip lasted 2 seconds, long enough for Garrett to assess and short enough to communicate that the gesture was form, not substance. "Ashford, glad you could make it, wasn't sure you'd come. Wouldn't miss it." Garrett's eyes moved to Adrienne. Appraising. The look lasted a fraction too long, the reflexive assessment of someone accustomed to cataloging the people around him by their usefulness. "And who's your guest?" "A colleague." "Colleague." Garrett repeated the word the way he'd repeated methodology in his office 18 months ago, tasting it, finding it lacking, discarding it. "Well, enjoy the evening, open bar, mingle." The smile returned, wider now, pleased with itself. "And Ashford, the mousse is excellent. Make sure you try it before they clear the tables." He walked away. Nolan watched him go. The confident stride, the squared shoulders, the posture of a man who believed he controlled every variable in the room. Adrienne set her water glass down. "He has no idea." "None. Does that bother you?" "It used to. Now it's just evidence." The cocktail hour lasted 45 minutes. Nolan and Adrienne stayed at table 14. They didn't mingle, didn't approach the bar, didn't make any attempt to engage with the 300 people who filled the room with the low hum of professional socializing. They sat, and they watched, and they waited. At 7:45 p.m., the lights dimmed. The string quartet played a transitional piece. 300 guests found their tables, their name cards, their places in the hierarchy Margot had arranged on her tablet. Garrett Caldwell took the stage. The keynote was 15 minutes of self-congratulation, dressed as corporate leadership, revenue growth, market position. The Meridian family, a phrase he used 7 times, each repetition more hollow than the last for anyone paying attention to who was included in that family and who was seated beside the kitchen doors. "We've had our challenges this year," Garrett said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd never been challenged by anyone with the power to respond. "Restructuring is never easy, but the team that's here tonight, this room, these people, you are the reason Meridian Capital continues to excel." Polite applause, glasses raised. The collective agreement of people who benefited from the system celebrating its continuation. "I want to recognize a few individuals who've gone above and beyond." He launched into the awards portion. Top performer, rising star. Client relations excellence. Each name called with Garrett's trademark combination of authority and condescension, as if granting recognition were an act of generosity rather than acknowledgement. During the awards, Darnell Okafor, still employed at Meridian, still silent, still calculating the arithmetic of survival, left his table and walked to the back of the room. He stopped at table 14. Nolan looked up. Darnell leaned down. His voice barely carried above the applause for the latest award recipient. "I need to tell you something. After you left, Margot shredded a box of files from the HR archive. I saw her doing it. 6 a.m. on a Saturday, the week after your termination. I couldn't see what was in them, but the box label said, Employee Relations, Closed Cases, 2019 through 2023. Nolan's expression didn't change. He filed the information the way he'd filed everything for 18 months. Instantly, completely, without visible reaction. Shredded files, HR archive, closed cases spanning 5 years. The same 5 years during which 43 EEOC charges had accumulated. When exactly? March 8th, Saturday. I was picking up some personal items I'd left Friday night. She didn't see me. Nolan nodded. Thank you, Darnell. Darnell didn't leave. He shifted his weight, looked toward the stage where Garrett was now making a joke about compliance audits that drew laughter from people who'd never read one, then back at Nolan. I looked you up after you got fired. Wanted to send you a message, see if you were okay. Found a Nolan Ashford on the DOJ website. Employment litigation section, trial attorney. Same Georgetown degree, same face. The ballroom noise filled the silence between them. 300 people eating, drinking, applauding, unaware that 5 feet from the kitchen doors, a conversation was taking place that would reframe everything they thought they knew about the man at table 14. That's you, isn't it? Nolan met Darnell's eyes. The moment held. 2 black men in a room full of people who'd treated them as furniture, one of them about to reveal that the furniture had been taking notes. Darnell, I need you to go back to your table and not mention this to anyone for the next 30 minutes. Darnell straightened, nodded once, the nod of someone who'd just confirmed a suspicion that changed the shape of the past 18 months. He walked back to his seat without looking at anyone. His hands were steady. His face was calm. But something behind his eyes had shifted. The arithmetic of survival recalculating to include the possibility that silence hadn't been the only option. On stage, Garrett wrapped up the awards. Dessert service began. Chocolate mousse in stemmed glasses, because even the food at a Meridian gala was designed to project refinement. The room settled into the comfortable noise of people who believed the evening's agenda was complete. It wasn't. At 8:12 p.m., the ballroom doors opened. 2 individuals entered. A man and a woman, both in dark suits, both carrying credentials that caught the overhead light with the dull gleam of federal authority. They walked with the purposeful efficiency of people who'd done this before, whose entry into rooms was not social but procedural. The woman carried a sealed envelope. The man carried a briefcase. They crossed the ballroom floor, 300 pairs of eyes tracking their movement, the room's conversational volume dropping incrementally with each step. Something about them didn't match the evening. Their suits were wrong, government cut, not corporate. Their posture was wrong, operational, not social. Their direction was wrong, not toward the bar or the buffet but toward the head table, where Lawrence Pratt sat with Garrett, Margot, Boyd Landon, and 2 other board members. The woman reached the head table first. She produced the sealed envelope and placed it in front of the board chairman with the careful formality of someone serving legal process. Mr. Pratt, this is a formal notice of intent to sue, served on behalf of the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Employment Litigation Section, pursuant to Bon Mui Hai USC Section, Haingin Agat Noi Sao Mo Ngoc Dun Bi Dong Ngoc Dun. You are the named representative of Meridian Capital Group, the respondent. Pratt, 63, white, a corporate attorney by training who'd chaired Meridian's board for 9 years, looked at the envelope without touching it. His face performed a rapid series of calculations. Legal exposure, public relations, personal liability, visible in the sequence of micro-expressions that crossed his features before professional composure reasserted itself. I'll need to have counsel review this. Of course. The woman stepped back. Then Nolan stood. The chair pushed back from table 14 with a sound that cut through the ballroom's ambient noise, not loud but precise, the way certain sounds carry in spaces designed for acoustics. He walked toward the head table, not hurrying, not hesitating. The distance from table 14 to the stage was 67 feet. He covered it in 23 steps, each one watched by 300 people who were beginning to understand that the evening's entertainment had not gone according to plan. Garrett saw him coming. The smile started, reflexive, the automatic amusement of a man watching someone approach who he believed had no power. But the smile stalled halfway, stuck between its origin and its destination, because something about Nolan's walk was wrong. The posture, the direction, the fact that 2 federal employees had just served documents, and the fired analyst was now approaching the head table as if he belonged there. "What are you—" Garrett began. "Mr. Pratt." Nolan's voice carried the full distance of the ballroom, not raised, not theatrical. Projected, the way trial attorneys project in courtrooms where juries sit 30 feet away and every word must land with precision. "My name is Nolan Ashford. I'm a senior trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Employment Litigation Section." The room went silent. Not gradually, instantly. 300 people stopped chewing, stopped drinking, stopped breathing at normal rates. The string quartet's bow hung suspended over the cello's strings. A waiter froze mid-pour, red wine hovering above the glass. The document before you is a formal notice of intent to sue, served pursuant to Bon Mui Hai USC Section, Haingin Agach Noi Sao Mo Ngoc Don Bi Dong Ngoc Don, requiring 30 days' notice before filing a pattern or practice action against an employer engaged in systemic discrimination. Meridian Capital Group is the named respondent. The investigation that generated this notice has been active for 14 months. Garrett's glass sat on the table where he'd set it. His hand still held the shape of the stem, fingers curled around nothing, the gesture of someone who'd lost contact with the physical object that anchored him to normalcy. Margot's tablet, the seating chart, the hierarchy she'd arranged, slid from her lap to the floor. She didn't retrieve it. Boyd Landon, outside counsel, reached for the envelope. His hands were steady, the trained composure of an attorney who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether this became a manageable legal matter or an institutional catastrophe. He opened the seal. Read the first page, the second. Set the document down. "Garrett, don't say a word." "But not a word." Nolan continued. Each sentence landed with the calibrated weight of evidence compiled over 18 months and verified across 43 individual complaints. The EEOC's Richmond office referred this matter to the Department of Justice 11 months ago, following the accumulation of 43 individual charges of employment discrimination filed against Meridian Capital Group between 2019 and 2024. 31 of those charges were filed by employees identifying as Black or Hispanic. 27 allege racial discrimination and termination. 14 allege retaliation for engaging in protected activity under Title 10. He paused. Let the numbers sit. 43 charges, 5 years. The weight of institutional behavior so consistent it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence, couldn't be explained as isolated incidents, couldn't be reduced to the actions of a single bad manager or a single flawed policy. The department's investigation included statistical analysis of termination rates, comparative performance evaluation data, compensation analysis, and documentary evidence of coordinated retaliation against employees who filed complaints with internal reporting systems or external agencies. Adrienne Calloway appeared beside him. She opened the leather portfolio and placed a second document on the table. The investigative summary, 84 pages, bound with federal seals. This summary represents 14 months of document review, witness interviews, and data analysis conducted by the Employment Litigation Section in coordination with the EEOC. Preliminary findings include the following. He read, not from memory this time, from the document, because precision mattered more than performance, and the words on the page had been reviewed by 3 attorneys, 2 statisticians, and a federal judge who'd approved the civil investigative demand that produced the evidence. Minority employees at Meridian Capital were terminated at 3.7 times the rate of white employees in comparable positions during the period under review. Performance evaluations showed systematic scoring disparities correlating with race rather than performance metrics. Specifically, Black employees receiving meets expectations ratings were 4 times more likely to be terminated within 12 months than white employees with identical ratings. Internal communications recovered pursuant to civil investigative demand reveal coordinated efforts by senior management to suppress employee complaints and retaliate against individuals who engaged in protected activity. He set the summary down, picked up a third document, a single page, a printout of an email that Margot Sinclair and Garrett Caldwell had never expected to see outside of Meridian's internal server. Exhibit D17. Internal email from Garrett Caldwell to Margot Sinclair, dated 14 months prior. Subject line, compliance hire, body. Nolan read slowly, giving each word the space it needed to reach every corner of the silent ballroom. New analyst starts Monday. Keep him busy with the old files. If he causes problems, use the PIP process. Same playbook as the others. 6 words that transformed 18 months of individual humiliation into evidence of institutional strategy. 6 words that connected Nolan's experience, the mispronounced name, the restricted badge, the stolen lunch, the missing invitations, the fabricated complaint, the corrupted documents, the parking garage threat, the stairwell assault, the culture fit assessment, the PIP, the termination. To a pattern repeated across years, across dozens of employees, across a system designed to eliminate people who didn't fit the demographic profile Meridian's leadership preferred. The ballroom absorbed the words the way stone absorbs rain, slowly, the impact deepening rather than dispersing. At table 3, Preston Voss set his dessert spoon down with a click that was audible 6 tables away. His face had gone the particular shade of white that appears when someone realizes their actions, performed in the assumed privacy of after-hours offices and corrupted shared drives, have been observed and cataloged by a federal attorney. His hand trembled. The spoon trembled with it. At the entrance, Brock Tillman's radio earpiece crackled with the security team's confused chatter. His hand moved toward it. Instinct, the urge to coordinate, to control, to respond the way he'd always responded to situations that threatened the firm's equilibrium. Then his hand stopped, because the threat wasn't external. The threat was standing at the head table, reading from federal documents, and the man who'd always been the firm's instrument of physical intimidation understood, with the slow dawning clarity of someone whose toolkit had just become irrelevant. That muscle didn't matter when the authority in the room belonged to the Department of Justice. Janine Falk sat at table 6. She hadn't touched her moose. Her phone was in her hand, typing, deleting, typing again. The panicked digital gestures of someone trying to determine whether fabricating a complaint against a federal attorney carried different consequences than fabricating one against a compliance analyst. Her attorney's number was programmed into speed dial. She would call it 14 times before midnight. Garrett's face had passed through several stages since Nolan began speaking. Confusion first. Then, recognition. The dawning awareness that the man he'd invited as entertainment was not performing humiliation, but executing authority. Then anger, rising fast and hot. And now, settling across his features like frost. Fear. You can't. He looked at Boyd. Boyd, do something. Boyd Landon set the notice down, removed his glasses, cleaned them on his napkin. The methodical gesture of a man buying time before delivering advice his client wouldn't want to hear. Garrett, I am advising you, as your attorney, to stop talking. Immediately. Everything you say in this room can and will be used in the federal proceeding that this notice initiates. He worked here. He was a compliance analyst. You can't just... Garrett, Boyd's voice dropped to the register attorneys use when their clients are approaching the edge of self-destruction. I need you to close your mouth and keep it closed until we are in a private room with no witnesses. Do you understand me? Garrett's mouth opened. Closed. The muscles in his jaw worked silently. Rage without outlet, authority without jurisdiction. A man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, discovering that this room had been redesigned while he wasn't paying attention. Margot hadn't spoken since the notice was served. Her face held the particular stillness of someone performing calculations about personal criminal exposure. The EEOC notices she'd signed for and buried, the hotline complaints she'd intercepted, the personnel records she'd manipulated. Each one a potential count. Each one documented. Board Chairman Pratt stood. His chair scraped against the ballroom floor, a sound that seemed to release the room from paralysis. Conversations erupted at every table, 300 people processing the simultaneous realization that the evening's honored guest had just served federal legal papers on their employer. Mr. Ashford. Pratt's voice carried the careful formality of someone who understood that every word spoken from this moment forward would appear in depositions. I suggest we continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting. Agreed. The hotel's conference suite was on the second floor, a wood-paneled room with leather chairs and a long table designed for negotiations. The group that assembled there included Pratt, 2 board members, Boyd Landon, Garrett, Margot, Nolan, and Adrienne. The federal agents remained in the ballroom to answer questions from guests who'd begun demanding explanations from anyone with authority. The conference suite door closed. The room's air conditioning hummed. Outside, the muffled sound of 300 people realizing their employer was under federal investigation provided an ambient soundtrack that no one in the room acknowledged. Garrett dropped into a chair at the far end of the table. His tie was loosened, an unconscious gesture, the body's recognition of crisis before the mind caught up. Margot sat beside him, but angled her chair away. A physical separation that communicated what her silence had been suggesting since the ballroom. Her interests and Garrett's were no longer aligned. Boyd Landon took the seat opposite Nolan. His legal pad was open, his pen was still. The practiced stillness of an attorney who understood that the first person to speak in a negotiation reveals the most. Pratt sat at the head of the table, a position he'd occupied in boardrooms for 9 years, but which now felt less like authority and more like exposure. The 2 board members flanked him, their faces carrying the particular expression of people calculating personal liability. Board members could be named individually in federal suits if their oversight was sufficiently negligent. Both of them knew this. Both of them were thinking about their own attorneys. Nolan sat at the head of the table. Not by invitation, by right. The positioning communicated what credentials and documents had already established. The power dynamics in this room had reversed, and the person who'd been seated at table 14 was now directing the conversation. Adrienne opened the portfolio and arranged 4 documents in front of her: the notice, the investigative summary, the statistical analysis, and a timeline of individual complaints mapped against Meridian's internal actions. Each document was tabbed, cross-referenced, and annotated with the citations that connected individual acts to the pattern or practice standard. The Department of Justice is prepared to file a pattern or practice action in the Eastern District of Virginia within 30 days of today's service, unless Meridian Capital agrees to negotiate a consent decree addressing the systemic violations identified in the investigation. Boyd Landon opened his legal pad. What specifically is the department seeking? Nolan laid out the terms, each one calibrated to the evidence, each one reflecting months of internal discussion about what remedies federal courts would find reasonable and enforceable. First, a consent decree with a compliance period of not less than 3 years, subject to monitoring by an independent court-appointed monitor. Second, mandatory revision of termination procedures to require dual authorization, both the supervising manager and an independent HR review, with full documentation accessible to the monitor. Third, mandatory anti-discrimination and anti-retaliation training for all supervisory personnel, 40 hours annually for the duration of the consent decree. Fourth, creation of an independent ombudsman position, reporting to the board, not to HR, to receive and investigate employee complaints. Fifth, a settlement fund for compensatory relief to affected employees, amount to be determined through negotiation based on the scope of documented harm. Sixth, individual accountability for personnel who obstructed the EEOC process or participated in documented retaliation. The silence that followed was different from the ballroom silence. This was the silence of people counting costs, financial, professional, personal. The consent decree alone would transform Meridian's operations. The settlement fund would cost millions. The individual accountability provision meant that specific people in this room could face referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Garrett broke first. "This is a setup. He came in here. He took a job to spy on us." "Garrett." Boyd's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "I am not going to say it again. He infiltrated our company under false pretenses. That's fraud. It's a lawful investigation conducted by a duly authorized federal attorney in coordination with the EEOC, Adrienne said. Her first words in the room, quiet, precise, the diction of someone who'd argued before federal appellate panels and wasn't going to waste emotional energy on a man who still didn't understand his position. Mr. Ashford accepted employment at Meridian Capital using his legal name, his actual educational credentials, and a legitimate work history. No misrepresentation was made on any application or during any interview. He performed the duties assigned to him competently, as your own client review from Whitfield National Bank will confirm. The fact that he also documented civil rights violations he observed during the course of that employment is not fraud. It's witness testimony. Boyd set his pen down. The legal pad in front of him held 4 lines of notes, not strategy, not defense, just the terms Nolan had stated, copied in the handwriting of an attorney who understood that his client's position was, in technical terms, catastrophic. "We need time to review the investigative summary and the notice. You have 30 days from today's service." Nolan stood. Adrienne gathered the portfolio. "After that, the United States files in the Eastern District. Discovery will be extensive. The 43 individual complainants will have the opportunity to intervene. Media coverage is not something we control, but I'd note that 3 reporters from Richmond and 2 from national outlets are currently in the ballroom." He paused at the door, looked back at the table, at Garrett, whose jaw worked silently around words that couldn't help him, at Margot, whose stillness had the quality of someone already calculating plea options, at Pratt, whose face held the expression of a man watching his legacy crumble in real time, at Boyd, who was already drafting the recommendation he'd deliver tomorrow morning. Settle fast, settle at any reasonable cost. One additional item. We have reason to believe that HR records were destroyed after this investigation became known to company personnel. Spoliation of evidence in a federal investigation carries penalties under Moi Tam USC section Mot Ngin Num Trum Mui Chin, up to 20 years imprisonment. If additional document destruction occurs between now and the resolution of this matter, the department will pursue criminal referral. He didn't name Margot. Didn't need to. Every person in the room knew who'd signed for the EEOC notices, who controlled the HR archive, who'd been seen shredding files at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning the week after Nolan's termination. The door closed behind him. In the hallway, Adrienne exhaled, the first uncontrolled breath either of them had taken since entering the hotel. Boyd's going to recommend settlement by end of week. End of week is optimistic. Nolan loosened his tie, the first casual gesture he'd made since that morning. He'll need the board's authorization. Pratt will want independent counsel review. The insurance carrier will need notification. Realistically, 3 to 4 weeks. And Garrett? Garrett will do what narcissists do when cornered. He'll blame everyone else, deny responsibility, and try to negotiate his way out of consequences. Boyd will advise him to cooperate. Whether he listens depends on whether his ego is stronger than his survival instinct. They walked through the lobby. The ballroom doors were open, guests streaming out, phones to ears, the coordinated communication of people processing institutional crisis in real time. 2 reporters approached Nolan with recorders extended. He declined comment and kept walking. Outside, the Richmond night was cool. The James River was invisible in the darkness, but present in the humidity, the faint smell of water and the ambient sound of current moving south toward the coast. Nolan stood on the sidewalk, looked up at the Jefferson Hotel, lit gold against the night sky, its architecture as confident as ever, its ballroom now containing the wreckage of an evening that Garrett Caldwell had designed as entertainment, and Nolan Ashford had converted into federal procedure. His phone buzzed. Text from Darnell Okafor. Just watch the whole thing from table 9. I don't have words. Nolan typed, "You had the courage to tell me about the shredding. That mattered." Darnell's reply, "What happens now?" Now the system does what systems do. Slowly. He drove home. The apartment was dark. The kitchen table still held the organized archive. 3 notebooks, printed emails, screenshots, the evidence package that had been his companion for 18 months. He didn't move them. They'd be needed for the negotiation phase, for the depositions that would follow, for the long procedural grind that would determine whether 43 people's complaints produced accountability or just another settlement that changed nothing. He checked his phone. 17 missed calls, 9 text messages, 3 voicemails. The first voicemail was from a reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch requesting comment. The second was from a former Meridian employee he didn't recognize, a woman who'd been terminated in 2020 and wanted to know if the thing at the gala meant her complaint would finally be heard. The third was from his mother. "Nolan, I saw something on the news. A company in Richmond. Your old job. They're saying a federal attorney was working there undercover. Is that you?" A pause. The sound of the common room television in the background, the anchor's voice describing events at the Jefferson Hotel. "I told you to be careful. Call me." He called her back. It was after 10 p.m., past the facility's usual quiet hours, but Dolores Ashford answered on the second ring, the alertness of a mother who'd been waiting. "Mama. Is it true?" Most of what they're reporting. Some of it's already wrong. I wasn't undercover. I was employed. There's a legal difference. The difference between undercover and employed doesn't matter to a mother who just watched her son's face on Channel 12. He sat on the edge of his bed. The charcoal suit still on, the tie loosened, the federal credentials still in his breast pocket. The adrenaline that had carried him through the evening was receding, leaving behind it the particular exhaustion of sustained performance, the bone-deep weariness that comes from spending 18 months being one person in public and another in private. "I'm fine, Mama." "Are you safe?" "I'm safe." "Those people you worked for, the ones on the news, they looked angry." "They have reason to be. Angry people do stupid things, Nolan." "I know, but the hard part is done. The rest is procedure." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, slightly uneven, the Parkinson's affecting the muscles that controlled respiration, a progression her doctors had noted at the last appointment. He filed it. Data point, medical, the way he filed everything, the habit so deep it operated independent of intention. "Your father would have been proud." The words landed somewhere Nolan hadn't expected. not in the professional compartment where he stored case outcomes and legal analysis, but in the personal one, the one he'd kept locked for 18 months because opening it would have compromised the mission. I hope so. He would. Go to sleep, eat breakfast, and call me tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. He hung up, sat in the dark for a long time, not thinking about the consent decree or the negotiation timeline or the 43 complainants whose notifications were already in the mail. Thinking about the man who'd walked into Meridian Capital 18 months ago, younger by a measure that wasn't chronological but experiential. That man had believed the evidence would speak for itself. This man knew better. Evidence didn't speak. It was spoken for by people willing to absorb the cost of being the ones who said the uncomfortable things in the rooms where silence was expected. He made coffee, sat at the table, allowed himself 5 minutes of something that wasn't strategy or documentation or the careful suppression of emotion that had carried him through 1.5 years of institutional abuse. 5 minutes of feeling it. The parking garage, the stairwell, the hand on his shoulder, the hand on his chest, the elbow in his ribs, the lunch in the trash, the birthday no one acknowledged, the name no one bothered to learn. 18 months of being treated as less than competent, less than professional, less than human, by people who believed the hierarchy they'd built was permanent, and the man they'd assigned to its lowest rung would stay there. 5 minutes. Then the calm returned. He opened his laptop and began drafting the negotiation timeline. The weeks that followed moved at the pace systems move when consequences arrive, not the dramatic speed of television legal proceedings, but the grinding, incremental, procedurally exhausting rhythm of actual federal litigation. Boyd Landon, to his credit, recommended settlement within 72 hours of the gala. His memo to the board, which would later become part of the public record when the consent decree was filed, was blunt. The Department of Justice's evidence is substantial. 43 individual complaints supported by statistical analysis, documentary evidence of coordinated retaliation, and the testimony of a federal attorney who personally observed and documented discriminatory practices over an 18-month period. Litigation in the Eastern District would be prolonged, expensive, and almost certainly unsuccessful. I recommend immediate engagement with DOJ to negotiate a consent decree on the most favorable terms available. The board authorized negotiations. Pratt retained independent counsel, a firm from Washington with experience in pattern or practice settlements, to advise on the process. The insurance carrier was notified and immediately began calculating exposure. Garrett Caldwell was placed on administrative leave. The board's press release described this as a leadership transition during a period of organizational review, language that communicated nothing and obscured everything. Garrett's LinkedIn profile continued to list him as regional vice president for another 3 weeks before someone in the communications department quietly changed his status to former executive. He did not go quietly. In the 72 hours between the gala and his suspension, Garrett called Boyd Landon 14 times, sent 9 emails to board members arguing that the investigation was politically motivated, and drafted a statement for the Richmond Times-Dispatch claiming that Nolan Ashford had infiltrated the company under false pretenses as part of a federal vendetta. Boyd intercepted the statement before it reached the newspaper. The emails were preserved as evidence. On the second day, Garrett went further. He contacted Preston Voss, Jeanine Falk, and 3 other employees directly, by personal cell phone, not company email, an attempt at operational security that demonstrated how poorly he understood the scope of the investigation he was facing. The calls lasted between 4 and 11 minutes. In each one, according to statements the employees later provided to DOJ counsel, Garrett urged them to stay quiet, to stick to the official version of events, and to characterize Nolan's employment as suspicious from the start. The calls constituted potential witness tampering, a federal offense under Moitam USC section Mot Ngin Num Trum Mui Hai, and Boyd Landon, upon learning of them, immediately withdrew from representing Garrett individually. A law firm cannot represent both a corporation and an employee whose personal conduct has potentially increased the corporation's liability. Garrett, suddenly without counsel, retained a criminal defense attorney from Northern Virginia, whose first act was to advise his new client to stop talking to everyone, about everything, immediately. Garrett's response to that advice was to call Pratt directly and demand reinstatement. Pratt declined the call. Garrett called again. Pratt's assistant informed him that all communications should be directed through counsel. Garrett sent a text message, 3 paragraphs, uncapitalized, punctuated by anger rather than grammar, threatening to go public with everything I know about how this board operates. The text became Exhibit E7 in the investigation file. Pratt forwarded it to independent counsel without comment. By the end of the first week, Garrett Caldwell had transformed himself from a target of a federal investigation into its most cooperative evidence source, not through testimony, but through the steady, compulsive generation of communications that documented his consciousness of guilt more effectively than anything the DOJ could have produced through formal discovery. His attorney stopped returning his calls on day 9, retained a new attorney on day 12. That attorney's first act was to negotiate a cooperation agreement, Garrett's testimony regarding board-level decisions, in exchange for the DOJ's agreement not to refer his witness tampering for prosecution. The cooperation agreement was sealed. Its contents wouldn't become public unless the case went to trial, which was unlikely given the consent decree negotiations. But its existence changed the calculation for everyone involved. Margot, whose defense relied partly on characterizing Garrett as the primary decision-maker, now faced the possibility that Garrett was cooperating. The board, whose oversight failures were Garrett's to describe, now understood that their former VP had every incentive to maximize his own culpability in exchange for leniency. And Boyd Landon, whose job had always been to protect the institution, now had to consider whether the institution he was protecting had a senior executive actively undermining its defense. The negotiations proceeded despite the chaos. Federal cases have their own momentum, and the procedural calendar didn't pause for Garrett's self-destruction. Margot Sinclair was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia for potential obstruction charges under Moitam U.S. C-Section Motngin Num Trum Le Num. The referral was specific: interception of EEOC, notices of charge, failure to route federal correspondence to appropriate corporate officers, manipulation of the internal ethics hotline to suppress discrimination complaints, and, pending forensic verification, destruction of HR records relevant to a federal investigation. Margot retained her own attorney, separate from Boyd, separate from the firm's counsel, a clear signal that her interest and meridians had diverged. Her attorney issued a statement: Ms. Sinclair categorically denies any wrongdoing and looks forward to vindicating her reputation through the appropriate legal channels. The investigation into the shredded files moved slowly. The destruction had occurred on March 8th, the Saturday after Nolan's termination. Building security logs confirmed Margot's badge scan at 6:02 a.m. The shredding company's records listed the disposal as routine document destruction per retention policy, invoking the firm's document management protocol as justification. But the protocol required authorization from both the department head and outside counsel for any destruction of employee-related records, authorization that, upon review, had never been obtained. The files themselves were gone, whatever they contained. Closed complaints, settlement agreements, separation terms from the employees. Meridian had pushed out over 5 years, existed now only in the memories of people who might never come forward. The DOJ filed a spoliation motion. The court took it under advisement. The motion remained pending. Brock Tillman was terminated, not for the parking garage threat, not for the stairwell assault, not for the physical intimidation that had been documented across 14 months and multiple incidents. He was terminated for falsifying security camera maintenance logs, 7 instances where camera Bongach Noi Bay was listed as offline for repair without corresponding work orders from the maintenance vendor. The falsification exposed the firm to liability for creating conditions that facilitated harassment. The union filed a grievance on Brock's behalf. The grievance was pending. The distinction mattered. Brock wasn't fired for what he'd done to Nolan. He was fired for the paperwork trail he'd left while doing it. The system didn't punish the violence. It punished the evidence of negligence that the violence exposed. The difference was procedural, not moral, and it said everything about how institutions process accountability, protecting themselves from liability while declining to address the behavior that created it. Brock's attorney filed a wrongful termination suit of his own within 3 weeks. The suit alleged that Meridian had terminated him as a scapegoat to satisfy federal investigators, and sought reinstatement, back pay, and damages. The irony? A man who'd physically intimidated a federal attorney now claiming victimhood at the hands of the institution he'd served was lost on no one except, apparently, Brock himself. The suit was pending in state court. Its outcome would depend on whether a jury found the camera log falsification independently terminable or whether it viewed the firing as pretextual. Employment law operated in both directions. The tools designed to protect employees from unjust termination could be wielded by anyone, including people whose termination was, by any reasonable assessment, long overdue for reasons the firm was unwilling to articulate. Meanwhile, an unexpected development complicated Margot's case. 2 weeks after the consent decree hearing, a paralegal at Boyd Landon's firm discovered a backup of Margot's email archive on a secondary server that IT had flagged for decommissioning but never actually wiped. The archive contained 14 months of correspondence, including a thread between Margot and an unnamed contact at the Virginia Employment Commission discussing the possibility of contesting EEOC jurisdiction on procedural grounds. The thread predated Nolan's first filing by 3 months. 3 months. Margot had been strategizing about EEOC jurisdiction before Nolan had even filed his charge. The implications were significant. If Margot had been preparing to obstruct federal complaints before they were filed, the timeline of her culpability extended further than the original referral suggested. The U.S. Attorney's Office requested the archive. Boyd Landon, now representing Meridian's corporate interests rather than any individuals, complied without objection. Margot's personal attorney issued a revised statement. Ms. Sinclair's communications regarding EEOC procedures reflected her professional responsibilities as HR director and do not constitute obstruction of any kind. The investigation continued. Preston Voss was transferred to Meridian's satellite office in Norfolk. No formal discipline was recorded. His document tampering, 14 files, 47 pages altered, 12 modifications after business hours, was characterized in the firm's internal review as collaborative editing misunderstandings arising from inadequate version control procedures. The characterization was absurd. Everyone involved knew it was absurd, but it provided the plausible deniability that allowed the firm to move Preston without acknowledging what he'd done. Preston accepted the transfer. Norfolk was a demotion in everything but title: smaller office, fewer clients, no proximity to the executive suite that had enabled his behavior. Whether he'd continue the same patterns in a new environment was a question no one at Meridian seemed interested in answering. Janine Falk remained employed. The fabricated complaint she'd filed against Nolan was under review, a status that had persisted for 4 months without resolution, the institutional equivalent of a file placed in a drawer that no one intended to open. Her attorney argued she'd acted in good faith based on information available at the time, a defense that collapsed under the weight of the complaint's own documentation. No date, no witnesses, no investigation, but which the firm's legal team declined to challenge, because challenging it would require admitting that the HR system had accepted fabricated evidence without question. If you've made it this far, you understand something about how real justice works. It's slow, it's partial, and it never punishes everyone equally. Hit that like button if you believe accountability matters even when it's imperfect. 4 months after the gala, Meridian Capital agreed to a consent decree. The negotiation had consumed 97 days, 41 meetings between DOJ counsel and Meridian's independent legal team, 14 rounds of document exchange, 6 disputed provisions that required mediator intervention, 3 points on which the parties reached impasse and agreed to let the court decide. The final decree was filed in the Eastern District of Virginia. Case number Baba Hai Hai Gach Noi Se Ve Gach Noi Kom Kom Bon Mot Tam Gat Noi Mohat Lo. United States of America vs. Meridian Capital Group, LLC, the Honorable Judge Margaret Xiaolin presiding. The terms represented what federal consent decrees always represent: a negotiated approximation of justice, satisfying no one completely, but establishing a framework for accountability that didn't exist before. 3-year compliance period, with independent monitoring. The court-appointed monitor, a former EEOC commissioner with 30 years of enforcement experience, would have full access to Meridian's HR systems, termination records, complaint processes, and personnel decisions for the duration. Mandatory revision of termination procedures. Dual authorization required, both the supervising manager and an independent HR review panel, with full documentation. No more single-signature firings. No more performance improvement plans based on culture fit rather than work product. Anti-discrimination training. 40 hours annually for all supervisory personnel. Not the PowerPoint and check-the-box variety that most companies use to satisfy compliance requirements, but facilitated workshops with scenario-based assessments and accountability metrics tied to performance reviews. Independent ombudsman. Reporting to the board, not to HR. A structural reform designed to prevent the closed loop that had allowed Margot to function as both the complaint system and its suppressor. Settlement fund. $2.8 million distributed among affected former employees. The math, $2.8 million across 43 complainants, averaged $65,000 per person. For some, it would cover the legal fees they'd spent pursuing their claims. For others, it would partially offset the lost wages, damaged credit, and professional setbacks that followed their terminations. For none of them would it undo what had been done. And the final line, the one that appeared in every corporate settlement, the one that legal departments insisted on and justice demanded rejection of. Meridian Capital Group admits no wrongdoing. No wrongdoing. The words sat at the bottom of the decree like a footnote to a fire, acknowledging the damage while denying the match. $2.8 million paid to 43 people whose careers were disrupted by a system designed to exclude them, and the institution that designed the system admitted nothing. Nolan read the final decree in his apartment, standing at the kitchen table that had served as his war room. He read every page, every provision, every carefully negotiated clause that represented months of work and years of harm. The decree was imperfect. He knew this. Every consent decree is imperfect, a compromise between the justice complainants deserve and the accountability institutions will accept. The monitor would push for compliance. The training would raise awareness. The ombudsman would create a reporting channel that hadn't existed before. The $2.8 million would reach people who'd been waiting years for someone to tell them their experiences mattered. But Garrett would land somewhere else. Preston would continue his career in Norfolk. Janine would remain at her desk. The system would adapt, absorbing the reform requirements the way organisms absorb antibiotics, developing resistance through compliance that met the letter of the decree while preserving the culture that made the decree necessary. This was the reality of institutional accountability, not the clean resolution of stories where every villain is punished and every victim is made whole, but the slow, partial, exhausting process of forcing systems to acknowledge harm they'd prefer to deny, and hoping that the acknowledgement, however grudging, creates space for the next generation to demand more. The 43 complainants received their notifications by mail. 28 had cooperated fully with the investigation. 11 had participated conditionally. 4 had declined. Of the 28, 17 attended the consent decree hearing, sitting in the gallery of the Eastern District courtroom watching a federal judge approve the terms that validated 5 years of complaints the system had tried to bury. Nolan sat at the counsel's table, Adrian beside him. Across the aisle, Boyd Landon represented Meridian, his legal pad full of notes that documented the controlled demolition of his client's legal position. Pratt was present, seated behind counsel, his first public appearance since the gala, his face carrying the gray pallor of a man who'd spent 4 months in rooms where every conversation concerned liability. Garrett was absent. His attorney had filed a motion to excuse his attendance, citing ongoing health concerns. The motion was granted without objection. No one in the courtroom missed him, Margot was absent as well. Her attorney had requested a separate hearing date, citing her pending referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The referral created a conflict. Anything she said in the civil proceeding could be used in the criminal investigation. Her silence wasn't strategy. It was survival. The gallery held 37 people, 17 former Meridian employees, 4 attorneys representing individual complainants in related civil matters, 2 reporters, one from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, one from a national legal publication, 3 members of the public who'd followed the case online, and in the back row, Darnell Okafor, still employed at Meridian, still quiet, still watching. He'd taken a personal day to attend. He'd told his supervisor he had a dentist appointment. Judge Xiaolin reviewed the decree from the bench. Her questions were precise, technical, and directed exclusively at the enforcement provisions, the monitor's authority, the reporting requirements, the consequences for non-compliance. She approved the decree with one modification, extending the monitoring period from 3 years to 4, noting that the scope of documented violations suggests that 3 years may be insufficient to ensure meaningful cultural change within the organization. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, the 17 former employees filed out of the courtroom into the hallway. Some exchanged words, some embraced. One woman, who'd worked at Meridian for 7 years before being terminated in the 2021 restructuring, stood alone by the window, looking at the Richmond skyline, her hand pressed against the glass. Nolan approached her. She turned. Her eyes were wet, but her posture was straight. The bearing of someone who'd been fighting for years and had just received, if not victory, then at least recognition. "Thank you," she said. "Thank yourself. You filed. That's what started this." It didn't feel like it started anything. It felt like shouting into a void. 43 voices shouting into the same void eventually break through. She nodded, turned back to the window. Nolan left her there, standing in the particular light of institutional hallways where justice arrives not as vindication but as paperwork, where the distance between filing a complaint and seeing it acknowledged can span years and cost everything. Outside the courthouse, the 17 former employees dispersed into the Richmond afternoon. Some walked in pairs, comparing notes, exchanging contact information, building the informal networks that survivors of institutional harm create when the formal systems fail them. Others walked alone, their relationship to the case private, their participation a quiet act of testimony that required no audience beyond the judge who'd approved the decree. Darnell Okafor found Nolan on the courthouse steps. He'd come from the back row, moving against the flow of people exiting. He stopped 3 feet away, the distance of someone who wanted to speak but wasn't sure the words existed for what needed to be said. "You sat at that cubicle for 18 months, next to the copy room, and you were, the whole time, you were working. We all were." The observation was precise. They had all been working. Nolan building a case, Darnell surviving a system, the 43 complainants each contributing testimony to a pattern none of them could see in full from their individual positions. The case wasn't built by one person. It was built by 43 people who'd each said, in their own way, "This happened to me," and by a legal system that, slowly, imperfectly, grudgingly, had listened. "What happens now?" Darnell asked. "The monitor starts work next month. The ombudsman position posts next week. Training begins in September. And Margot's case goes to the U.S. attorney." "And Garrett?" "Garrett is Garrett's problem now." Darnell almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles moved, the intention formed, but the expression settled into something more complex than amusement. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of someone who'd watched power operate unchecked for years and was seeing for the first time the machinery of accountability engage. "Take care of yourself, Nolan." "You too, Darnell." They shook hands. The grip was brief but firm, the contact of people who shared something deeper than friendship and more durable than circumstance. Then Darnell walked to his car, and Nolan walked to his, and the courthouse steps were empty except for the security guards and the pigeons and the quiet mechanics of a building that processed justice one case at a time, each one a small adjustment to a system that bent but never quite broke. In the weeks that followed, the story faded from headlines the way institutional stories always do, replaced by newer outrages, fresher injustices, the constant cycle of revelation and amnesia that characterizes public attention to systemic harm. The consent decree was a matter of public record. The monitor began her work. The settlement checks were processed. Meridian Capital Group continued to operate. The building on East Main Street kept its lights on. The lobby still displayed the diversity statement. New employees were hired, onboarded, assigned cubicles. The compliance department, now staffed at recommended levels with the dual authorization termination process in place, functioned under the monitor's oversight. Whether the culture had changed or merely adapted was a question that would take years to answer. Whether the training produced genuine awareness or just better informed discretion was unknowable in the short term. Whether the ombudsman would receive complaints or serve as decoration, another box checked, another system designed to project accountability rather than practice it, remained to be seen. Nolan returned to his regular caseload at the DOJ. The Meridian case joined his portfolio, one entry among others, a victory measured not in absolutes but in increments, in the distance between what was and what the decree made possible. He visited his mother on a Tuesday evening. She was in the common room, same window, same bird feeder. The Cardinals returned for the season. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" "Lighter." She held his hand. Her tremor was slightly worse than the last visit. The Parkinson's progressing at its own institutional pace, indifferent to consent decrees and settlement funds and the outcomes of federal litigation. "You're done with that thing you were doing?" "For now." "Was it worth it?" He considered the question. 18 months in a cubicle next to a copy room, 3 leather notebooks filled with evidence, a parking garage where a man grabbed his arm, a stairwell where a man shoved him against a wall, a copy room where a woman drove her elbow into his ribs, a ballroom where a man tried to use him as entertainment, $2.8 million that didn't undo any of it, a consent decree that admitted nothing. It was worth it for the 43 people who filed complaints and were told their experiences didn't matter. It mattered to them. And to you? I'm still figuring that part out. She squeezed his hand. The birds moved at the feeder, quick, purposeful, their rhythms undisturbed by the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. His phone buzzed. He checked it with the automatic attention of someone whose work never fully paused. Text from Adrian Calloway. "Pratt's personal attorney contacted us today. Wants to discuss board-level decisions made before Caldwell's hiring. Says there are patterns going back to 2015. Could go deeper than we thought." Nolan read the message twice, set the phone face down on the chair's armrest. "Mama? I might be busy for a while." "You're always busy." She turned back to the birds. "Just don't forget to eat." He sat with her until the light changed, until the cardinals left and the sparrows settled, until the silence between them was the only peace either of them needed. Then he drove home. The kitchen table was clear now, the archive transferred to federal evidence storage, the notebooks logged and cataloged, the screenshots and audit logs integrated into the case file that would remain active for the 4-year monitoring period. The table held only a coffee mug, a laptop, and the gala invitation, still in its envelope, gold lettering catching the kitchen light. He should have filed it with the other evidence. It was Exhibit D12's physical counterpart, the invitation that became proof of discriminatory intent when paired with the Slack message that accompanied it. Instead, he left it on the table. A reminder, not of the humiliation it was designed to inflict, but of the assumption behind it, the belief that power is permanent, that hierarchy is natural, that the person you dismiss today will remain dismissed tomorrow. That assumption had cost Meridian Capital $2.8 million, a 3-year consent decree extended to 4, the careers of its regional VP and HR director, its reputation in the Richmond business community, and the comfortable certainty that the system it had built was sustainable. It had cost Nolan 18 months of his life, a bruise on his ribs, a mark on his chest, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being treated as less than human by people who believe they're more. Whether the cost was proportional, whether the decree was enough, whether the settlement was fair, whether the system would change or just adapt, was a question that wouldn't be answered in his lifetime. Institutions move at geological pace. Culture shifts in increments invisible to the people living through them. The monitor would file quarterly reports. The ombudsman would receive complaints. The training would continue. And somewhere in the building on East Main Street, someone would look at the diversity statement in the lobby and wonder whether it was a promise or a prop. 3 months after the consent decree was signed, Garrett Caldwell resurfaced. Not at Meridian, at a smaller financial services firm in Northern Virginia, hired as senior strategic advisor, a title that obscured his function while preserving his access to the kind of institutional power he'd always believed was his birthright. His LinkedIn profile made no mention of the consent decree. His new firm's website described him as a seasoned executive with 26 years of industry leadership. The Monitor's first quarterly report noted the connection. A footnote on page 47. Former Meridian Capital Regional VP Garrett Caldwell has accepted a position at Piedmont Financial Services, LLC, a firm with no current DOJ oversight. The Monitor recommends that any Meridian employees or former employees who interact with Piedmont in a professional capacity report the contact to the Ombudsman's office. A footnote. 47 pages into a quarterly report that most people would never read. The system's way of acknowledging a problem without solving it. Documentation as substitute for action, the bureaucratic equivalent of writing something in a leather notebook and closing the cover. The Monitor also noted in the body of the report that Piedmont Financial Services had hired 2 other former Meridian executives in the same quarter, both of whom had left Meridian during the investigation, both of whom had been named in internal communications the DOJ had obtained during discovery. The pattern suggested not a coincidence but a migration, the architecture of institutional discrimination relocating from one host to another, the way bacteria survive antibiotic treatment by finding untreated tissue. Nolan read the footnote. Read the pattern analysis. Forwarded both to Adrienne with a single-line note. Piedmont, worth watching. Her reply came in 4 minutes. Already on it, new CID being drafted. Civil investigative demand. The opening move of a new investigation. The machinery grinding forward into another firm, another set of documents, another set of people who believed their hiring decisions were invisible because they happened behind closed doors in a building nobody was watching. Whether anyone would act on it remained, as these things always do, under review. Meanwhile, the woman from the courthouse, the one who'd stood at the window looking at the Richmond skyline, had used her portion of the settlement fund to hire an employment attorney. Not to bring another claim against Meridian, to file a new complaint against her current employer, a mid-size accounting firm in Virginia Beach that had, she told the attorney, a culture that felt familiar in all the wrong ways. Her complaint cited the same provisions of Title Bay that had underpinned the Meridian case. The EEOC's Norfolk office opened a file. 44 was becoming 45. The numbers didn't stop because the consent decree was signed. They continued because the conditions that generated them continued. In other firms, other offices, other buildings where diversity statements hung in lobbies and discrimination operated in the spaces between what was said and what was done. This was the lesson. Not that one case could fix a system, but that one case could demonstrate, to the 45th person and the 100th and the 1000th, that filing mattered, that documentation mattered, that the void they were shouting into wasn't empty. It was full of other voices, other complaints, other leather notebooks, recording the same patterns in different handwriting. And somewhere in that accumulation, in the weight of it, in the undeniable mass of testimony that no institution could dismiss as isolated, accountability became possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, not clean or swift or proportional, but possible. And possibility was enough to justify the next complaint, the next filing, the next person who sat in a cubicle beside a copy room and decided that silence was no longer an option. Whether anyone would act on it remained, as these things always do, under review. And in the server room on the 7th floor of Meridian Capital's building on East Main Street, a backup email server sat in a rack marked decommissioned, hardware failure. The server had stopped responding 2 weeks after the gala, a timing that the DOJ's digital forensics team noted in their preliminary assessment as highly coincidental. The server had contained archived internal communications from 2018 through 2021, precisely the period covered by the earliest EEOC complaints. Meridian's IT consultant, a contractor retained by Boyd Landon's firm specifically for the forensic review, declared the data unrecoverable. The hard drives showed signs of what the consultant described as cascading sector failure consistent with age-related hardware degradation. The DOJ's own digital forensics team disagreed. Their preliminary analysis suggested the drives had been subjected to a degaussing protocol, a controlled magnetic wipe that destroys data while leaving physical hardware intact. The technique was sophisticated, not something an HR director would know how to perform, which raised a question the investigation hadn't yet answered. Who else at Meridian had the technical capability and the motivation to destroy evidence, and whose name hadn't appeared in any of the documents the DOJ had obtained? The forensic report was expected in 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, the drives sat in a federal evidence locker, metal platters holding the ghosts of emails that might have contained the proof the consent decree was too diplomatic to demand. Darnell Okafor's situation resolved quietly. 3 weeks after the consent decree hearing, he submitted his resignation from Meridian Capital. His resignation letter was 2 sentences, the minimum required by company policy. He'd been offered a position at a nonprofit focused on employment discrimination, a referral that came through the network of former Meridian employees who'd connected during the investigation. The salary was lower, the work was harder. But for the first time in 3 years, Darnell would walk into a building without calculating which version of himself was safe enough to present. He texted Nolan on his last day. "Cleaned out my desk, felt lighter than I expected." Nolan replied, "That's what happens when you stop carrying other people's silence." 6 to 8 weeks. The timeline of systems that move at their own pace, indifferent to the urgency of the people waiting for answers. Nolan's phone buzzed one more time that evening. Not Adrian, not Darnell, an unknown number, a Richmond area code he didn't recognize. The voicemail was brief, a woman's voice, careful, uncertain. "Mr. Ashford, you don't know me. My name is Teresa Grimes. I worked at Meridian Capital from 2017 to 2020. I saw the news about the consent decree. I have documents, things I kept when I was terminated, performance reviews, emails. I didn't know who to give them to before. I think I know now. Please call me back." Nolan saved the voicemail, set the phone on the table beside the gala invitation. 43 complainants had built the foundation. 44 had just announced herself. The morning light would come, the coffee would brew, the laptop would open, and the work, slow, exhausting, incremental, imperfect, and absolutely necessary, would continue. Because that was the lesson Garrett Caldwell never learned, seated in his corner office with his bourbon and his certainty. The people you push to the margins don't disappear. They document, they file, they wait. And when the time comes, not on your schedule, but on theirs, they walk into the room you thought you owned and remind you that the invitation you sent as a joke was received as evidence. Number 43 was never the end of the story. It was the beginning.